really pretty Mariposa lily that's on the list.
You have to send me the spelling on that one.
I have a fun trivia fact in my talk today that I got from Wikipedia this morning, so that'll hopefully ease the burden.
There you go. Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It is 5 o'clock. I'm trying to keep us up on topic here because I know our good information is going to be coming late as soon as we start. So, hi, Supervisor Kelly Long. We're here for the Fillmore and Piru Basins Groundwater Sustainability Agency for March 18th. This is being recorded, and I would like to start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. If Ms. Director Kimball could lead us, perhaps. I brought my flag here with us. Hand over heart.
All right. Hand over heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next is our director's roll call. So Eva, if you could join us, run that for us.
Director Kimball,
Here.
Chair Long,
Here.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Here.
Director Minigan,
Yeah.
Director Pace. Oh, I saw him.
Here.
He's someplace.
Director Villaseñor.
Here.
Okay.
All right, all directors are in attendance today. Thank you so much. Next is our public comments. Do we have any public comments for today? None have been submitted. I don't see anything in the participants with a waved hand and no emails. So we will now move to the approval of the agenda. Is there any modifications, Mr. Emmerich, for the agenda or any other directors?
Chair Long, there are no proposed modifications to the agenda.
Okay, and with that, can I get a motion to approve the agenda as written?
So moved.
Okay, first by Director McFadden and second by Director Villaseñor. Was that a hand wave?
That was,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion is approved unanimously. Next is our updates from our directors. And so the first is our Fillmore Pumpers Association.
Chair Long, we had a combined Fillmore Piru Pumpers Association board meeting on Tuesday, March 9th. We reviewed, discussed, and approved the letter to the GSA on the subsidence SMC and had a good discussion about the cost of the added costs and ongoing costs of the 2 GPS monitors that are mentioned in the letter. And there was a general widespread support for the cost of those monitors. We discussed groundwater storage and groundwater elevation SMCs, and there was general support for the groundwater elevation SMC as proposed and listed in tonight's presentation. And there was support for matching elevations for the groundwater storage SMC. Lastly, there was an a concern expressed about the progress of the monitoring well project, and the members volunteered to help in any way they could to expedite the process or get access or any way we can help, because those of us who've drilled wells understand how difficult the process is and how time consuming it is. And there's a concern that we, and a general understanding that DWR does not give extensions on grants if you don't meet the deadline. So any way we can help. And then I'll let Glenn fill in whatever I've missed.
Thank you. Moving on to the Piru Pumpers Association.
I don't think Gordon has missed anything. He's been very thorough. So Piru Pumpers would just echo the same things I had in my notes about the subsidence memo that we'll be discussing tonight. I believe that came out, as well as those monitoring wells. So I think all in all, the concern, or the positive is we're making progress, we feel, but the concern is time is not on our side. And so there's an interest in the urgency of just making sure that we can have these things discussed and still get this package ready to complete the GSP. So time is still a big concern that we'd like to just making sure that we get stuff done inside the grant, as was explained, but also to make sure that we cover everything we can and get the GSP prepared. And that's it for Piru tonight.
Thank you very much. And next is our environmental stakeholders.
Hi, everyone. I don't have an update for environmental stakeholders. I'll be providing comment and feedback on the later agenda items under SMCs and GDE. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And United Water. That's you, Ed.
And I should also give my report with unmuted. Nothing new from me from United.
Okay, thank you very much. As for the county, the technical items have been provided to our groundwater department, and so they'll be reviewing them as well. I just want to make sure people know that. And we live in COVID world, so that's all we do is COVID. Congratulations on being in red. And also it is a 1 year mark of the pandemic, and just a wow that it's been 1 year. So thank you to everyone for all that you do to get us back and open and working. So I really just appreciate all of your efforts. I know Zoom like this is not the best for everybody, but until we can get together, this is what we have. So it's very nice to see all of you today, and thank you for your participation in our Fillmore Piru Groundwater Sustainable Agency. Next to you, Mr. Emmerich.
Good evening, board. Give a few things. Our receivables are about where they were last month, so that's a good thing. Looking at so that's down from a high of 57,000 in November 2020. Out of the $35,000 in receivables we have one customer with 2 wells that represents $23,000 of that. So that's a bit of a problem, and we're going to have to keep working on what we can do with that customer. It's my understanding that that customer hasn't paid United for a few years too, and United is suing that customer. I wouldn't advise that we enter into a lawsuit at this point, but that may be something that we need to do in the future regarding that customer, and exercise some of the tools that our legal counsel has provided us in the past. Regarding our grant, we did submit our progress report number 7 and invoice number 7 on time. Last week, we received questions from DWR on the progress report. And so staff is making edits to that, and will return an updated report to DWR this week. They were mostly asking how we're handling being over budget in a couple areas. So the two areas were grant administration and public outreach. And I think this board has been very supportive of public outreach and our expenditures along those lines. And so I don't intend to say that we're going to all of a sudden stop our efforts on stakeholder outreach. So we'll just say that the agency is absorbing those through its regular funding. Groundwater model. I think I had reported first that we were going to try to have updates by the end of February and then the end of March. Unfortunately, our groundwater modeling staff has been pulled in multiple directions over the past couple of months, and they are working busily on trying to get the documentation done. Their hope.
Oh, he froze. Hopefully he'll come back soon. Zoom has been having glitches today, at least on my end, all day long.
Yeah, Tony's frozen on my end.
He's
too.
okay. Well, he's probably saying some really wonderful things and giving us a good update. Let's see.
Do you want me to finish your sentence?
I think I'm back now. I turned my video off, but momentarily it looks like I had an internet connection outage. I don't know where did I freeze? Was I talking about model documentation?
Yes.
So the
There was some
target is April at this point. The techno staff are going to meet with their outside board of experts at the beginning of April. So hopefully that doesn't cause any problems with our Daniel B. Stevens and Associates team, and they can be provided to stakeholders that are interested in the documentation. We have reached out to Santa Clarita Valley Sanitation District regarding their chloride removal project, and they have agreed to give a presentation to this board sometime in the future. I don't think it's a big hurry, but I know it is a subject of interest to many of the pumpers, especially in the Piru Basin. And so they have agreed to do that, but we said, give us a little bit of time to get through some of this heavy lifting on our SMC development and the stakeholder participation. So they're standing by. We will bring a receivables collection program to you at some time in the future, but again, we're hoping not to clog up our agenda time while we're working hard on the task that's before us. So that's all I have for this evening.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we have legal counsel update. Any, Stephen?
Very brief. We've worked with staff since the last meeting on some well drilling templates for some contracts when we start drilling wells. Also about setting a special meeting and working on some potential use of easements for well acquisition. One kind of extracurricular I wanted to report on was that we've been involved in the groundwater adjudication in the Antelope Valley. And we just recently on Tuesday got a Court of Appeal decision in favor of our clients. It's an 85-page decision, so we're still dissecting it, but it addresses an issue that I've seen manifest in another GSA about overlying users asking the question, how can I be subject to an extraction fee if I'm an overlying user? And this case touches on it to some extent, so we're exploring that. I'll be reporting to Tony on that because it may inform some of our decision-making moving forward. So that concludes my report.
Thank you very much. And then our GSP consultant, Tony Emmerich. Or
Tony Morgan.
Tony Morgan.
Morgan.
That's okay, I'll step in.
Thank you.
Nope, no PowerPoint presentation this evening. I wanted to keep things extremely short, so we spend most of the time later on in the agenda. There was a GDE tech memo posted on the website for folks to take a look at recently. consultant team still working on various aspects of the GSPs, spending a lot of time analyzing and reanalyzing information as we continue to massage the SMCs and the rationales behind those. All those decisions require a little bit of analysis, or sometimes a lot of analysis time behind the scenes to come to something that we can present to you at the board meetings. Early on, you guys mentioned the monitoring well project. Yes, we left that off the agenda for this evening just because we were focusing on other things tonight and didn't want to clog up the agenda with an additional item. But we'll be back to you next month with a update on the monitoring well project. And that's it for me this evening.
Thank you very much. Moving on, after updates is our consent calendar.
Chair Long, if I
yes.
could just interject, sorry, I just want to give a
Please.
quick update from Fillmore.
Oh, why isn't that's not, I must have missed it. My apologies.
That's okay.
Thank you.
It's in the middle of a long list. So no, I just wanted to report out that I did bring up and summarize the SMC at our last city council meeting.
Okay.
And Fillmore is continuing to waive the water non-payment penalties during this COVID crisis and also water shutoffs. So the city council decided to extend that for another 120 days or until the governor officially ends the emergency declaration. And we, like you mentioned, we are in the middle of still COVID. But I'm really proud of Fillmore and Piru for stepping up and doing community members doing a PSA about vaccinations. And I'm happy to report that I think Fillmore may have their own vaccine clinic. We've done a farm worker clinic this past weekend. It was really successful. And so the Santa Clara Valley is really coming together, you know, and stepping up vaccine promotion, as well as testing is continuing. So just want to report that out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad you did that.
No
Appreciate
problem.
it. Anytime any of our directors, anyone has a question, please raise your hand or just interject. I appreciate it. Next item is the consent calendar. So we have 3 items. Is there any questions on any of these items from any of the directors? In hearing none, I would look for a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay, so I will take a first by Director Villasenor and a second by Director McFadden. And then any further discussion, roll call.
Director Kimball,
All right, aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villasenor,
Yes.
Okay, motion is approved. So I see that our item is a time certain 5:30. And so I have a few more minutes before that time certain. Is there anything that we can take care of on this before?
Chair Long,
Yes.
I think we might want to have discussion about whether we want to have a special board meeting. As Director Pace said earlier, that's the last agenda item, 5B.
Yes.
But I think that given the time that the groundwater dependent ecosystems tech memo came out,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we have folks who said they would like to provide comment letters and didn't have sufficient time to do that, I think it would be very worthwhile to think about having potentially a special meeting to finish up that discussion and receive people's comments and consider them between now and the next board meeting, which I believe is April 15th.
So are we looking at April 1st?
Well, April 1st would work with me. I think. So I'm one person that would like to be there.
Directors, if I put in April 1st and it would be at 5 o'clock? I got 1, 2 yeses. Gordon, yes. Glenn's a yes. Christina? Yes. All right. Slam dunk. in like 2 minutes. We just chose our special board meeting. Will be April 1st at 1 o'clock. Oh, sorry. I need a motion to approve.
I'll make the motion to approve, and Tony, thank you for making that recommendation. Appreciate the additional time so we can have valuable input.
Thank you. And a second, please.
I'll second.
Thank you. Second. And then roll call.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor,
Aye.
Perfect. This motion has been unanimous. If we could go to future topics of board discussion.
But
I
Chair
would-
Long,
Yes,
Chair
go
Long,
ahead.
before we do that, I want to make sure that that meeting is well noticed. Because it's a special board meeting, so people may think it's just a board of directors meeting, and really that needs to be almost a workshop, a stakeholder workshop, and it needs to be advertised like that. So I don't know if this would be an appropriate one for mailings, emailings, maybe even notice in papers. I think this is really important, and we need to make sure that all the stakeholders that are interested realize that this is their chance for input.
Thank you. And so, Tony, will we be doing the same that we normally do? I don't see Lisa. There she is. In regards to our public outreach.
Chair Long, we certainly would intend to advertise that much like we did this one. So it would be a special board meeting so that the board could take action, but with a primary focus on receiving additional stakeholder input. And I guess I would ask Eva, probably the longest thing would be to do the mailings, right? Because we can do notices on the website, we can do an email blast, but the newspaper notices and the mailings would be the longest lead item. And does a decision tonight allow you sufficient time to get those out?
yes.
Okay.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking that. And part of that, I was going to ask with a future topic is, are there deadlines for our technical papers to provide feedback? I believe we can provide feedback anytime, but when's the due date for this plan? I've heard some questions, and so if we could either bring that back at a future date, or if that's in the discussion of another item that I didn't know about, I would like to understand that so we can publicize that as well. Sometimes there's the feedback that we get late in the game, and it's very hard to make changes due to that. So I didn't know if there's any recommendations that come from DWR on that or anything.
Tony,
Chair Long, you bring up an important point, because when I circulated the tech memo, I got asked when is the deadline, and to Tony's point, it got circulated on Thursday. Our meeting is this Thursday. That really gave people 4 working days to review and make comment, which was very short. And the GDE tech memo is very important to the environmental stakeholder community, and so if we can provide a deadline so that we can try and facilitate collective input, that would be helpful. I'm obviously going to work towards the April 1st special meeting and try and get a comment out in the next 2 weeks. So that's provided ahead of that meeting. But for future tech memos and chapters of this plan, I think providing deadlines so that we can keep the ball rolling would be helpful.
Well, and I asked that for the subsidence technical, and we're going to talk about the sustainable management criteria. And as we do that, when's the deadline to provide feedback on that? And that'll help us also with gathering information. So if we could maybe bring that up so that our board can discuss that, that would be great. Are there any other future topics of board discussions people would want to, any directors would want to add for the next time? Hearing none. Okay, does anyone have a good joke? We got 6 minutes.
Hey, Kelly, I've got a comment about, or a compliment, I guess. I'd like to compliment the county for all the support and organization on the farm workers field vaccination program. It's been really successful for us and for a lot of our neighbors. So we really appreciate that. It's quite a relief to get our crews vaccinated. It's been a nightmare for the last year. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think it's really helped. We had the backpack medicine already working before the pandemic. And so utilizing them in our public health and doing mobile vaccines and actually going to each of the farms and doing the mobile vaccines for the farm workers has been really key to getting those most vulnerable vaccinated. It's been important for the health equity of the county to make sure we're getting those that really need it as quickly as possible, those essential workers. And so we have been very focused on Santa Clara Valley. As you see from, we just opened up the vaccination site at Santa Paula's old Kmart location. And we have there's quite a few different sites throughout the Fillmore and Santa Paula, and we've done a mobile site in Piru as well. So hopefully I was just talking with Dan, city manager in Santa Paula, and their numbers went from 4.8 to about 3.2. We've got about 24.8% total population vaccinated right now. And so out of 850,000 people, that's pretty good. But we want to do better. We just don't have enough vaccines right now to do it. We have the supply of people. We have people working at vaccine locations all ready to go. And we're just waiting for those vaccines. The good thing is on Monday, I mean, I've got a couple minutes so I can ramble on this. We have 16 to 64 are now able to get vaccinated for those with severe health problems. You just have to state what your health issue is, and you can get a vaccine. Also, all of our educators have the opportunity to get vaccinated by March 31st, which is another huge one. And then we are doing our mobile vaccines for farm workers, and that has been very well received. And we provide an education piece with that as well. There's a lot of people that are scared of the vaccine. They don't know what it's going to do to them. So just that education part too. And then we also pull in the health part. We do have our health clinics, and they're there for our community to utilize. So yeah, no, we're excited. On yesterday, St. Patty's Day, happy St. Patty's Day, we were able to go into the red, which is 25% of the restaurants will be open indoors on those cold, chilly nights. That's quite nice. 10% on the gyms. And then we have a lot of other locations that are now able to open inside, which has been very helpful. I do want to let you know of any businesses that you know of. The county has put together their second round of business grants up to a total of $20 million. Each business can receive $5,000, and that application process is going in quickly. So you go to venturacountyrecovers.org to find out the information on the business grants, vaccines, testing, and all the other dashboard information. Anyone want to learn anything else about COVID?
I'd like to, while we have a minute, say Friends of the Santa Clara River has been implementing the Water Talks program on behalf of the county. And the survey has been extended till the end of April. So what I can, and that's focused for disadvantaged community engagement on what their water needs are, and both Fillmore and Piru are disadvantaged communities. We have been assisted by the city of Fillmore and the Piru Neighborhood Council in spreading that information, but I will also put a link to that survey in the chat box for anyone who's interested. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much. And then we also have a Santa Clara River Watershed Committee meeting on March 25th at 9 a.m. to 11 in case anyone would like to know about that. And then out there, they do the GSA updates for all of Ventura County. So we will have a, Tony does a report for us, and that's been really appreciative. So thank you very much. All right, with that, why don't we get the slides set up and we can start. It is 5:30. Go for it, Tony Morgan.
Good evening, Kelly. I think I'm gonna
Oh, you're doing
kick
it
off
great.
the workshop. That's okay, Tony Morgan? Okay, cool. Super, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending this stakeholder workshop on the draft sustainable management criteria. I'm going to quickly put up the agenda for the workshop portion of tonight's meeting. You should be able to see that now. Okay, super, should be up there. Okay, so the primary purpose of tonight's workshop is to receive a feedback from stakeholders on the set of draft sustainable management criteria that have been developed over the past few board meetings. And we also refer to those as SMCs, if anybody is new to this language. So we'll begin the workshop with two presentations. We have Christian Broderick from Stillwater Sciences, and he'll provide an overview of that groundwater dependent ecosystems technical memo, which was mentioned previously. We also refer to those as GDEs for short. Then Tony Morgan with DBSNA will review the draft sustainable management criteria that were developed at prior board meetings. And he'll describe a little bit about how they were developed. And he also has some updated modeling information for us. So following the presentation, most of the meeting will be devoted to hearing input on the draft criteria. So we ask that, just to go back to the presentations, we're requesting that if everybody can hold your questions on the presentation, on each presentation until that presentation is finished. And I will call on you if you have your hand up or if you want to put a question in the chat box. We're also asking that during the presentation question section, we just have questions that clarify information in the presentation, just to make sure everybody understands what was presented. But if you can hold your comments about the criteria until we get to the discussion of the stakeholder input, that would be great. So we're trying to organize the stakeholder input and discussion session so that we go criteria by criteria, just to keep us organized and focused. And so we'll do them in the order that you see here. And during that discussion, there'll be board interaction, perhaps about questions about some of the comments, or if a board member wants to kind of flesh out some ideas presented. But I just want to note that the board will be deliberating on those draft criteria following the close of the workshop, which is agenda item 5A on our board meeting agenda. So we're aiming to complete this workshop within 2 hours. So we've got a lot to cover. So I may need to move us along at times so that we can get through all the topics tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christian for his presentation. I will stop sharing. Let me just see. I don't see any questions, so super.
Great. Let me share my screen. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
I see thumbs up. Good, that's excellent. All right, good evening. I'm Christian Broderick. I'm a geomorphologist with Stillwater Sciences, and lurking in the background in the audience is Bruce Orr, who's one of Stillwater's founders and has worked in the Santa Clara since I think 2002. And he's an ecologist, and so when we do get to the discussion point, he is an excellent resource for the ecological questions you may have. All right, let me see if I can get this thing to advance. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk briefly about what are GDEs. You've heard this before, or some of you have at least. Our approach to identifying GDEs, what the GDE units we identified are in the basin, and then we'll talk a little bit about their trends through time, and then we'll talk about special status species. And at the end of that, I'm going to have one slide that's an errata slide to, I made a copy and paste error when we were madly trying to get the document posted at the close of my business day, which apparently is 10 p.m. So I just want to correct that here. So what are groundwater dependent ecosystems? They are ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers or on the groundwater or on groundwater occurring near the ground surface. So that includes things like trees, which can use their roots to reach the groundwater. It also includes things like surface water that's connected to the groundwater table and the things that live in them. So those are the different ecosystems. And then once we identify the ecosystems, we can look at the special status species, that is species that are listed by various state or federal agencies as being imperiled or in some way. And so we first define our GDEs, and then we identify the special status species in them. And so there's a lot. That's what a lot of the in our preliminary discussion we had tonight when we were just starting, a lot of the crazy words that people saw in the report are part of the special status species. And our goal is to define the extent and composition, and then also the controls on GDE health. So that's what we're trying to do here. So before I get into what we did, I want to just have one slide on what we knew going in. Well, we knew more than this going in, but one of the things that's unique about this system is that there within the Fillmore and Piru basins, there are 3 forested riparian complexes that had surface water flowing and have had them since the early 1800s, the first records that people have found. This is work done by Aaron Beller. These were mostly cottonwood and willow forests. So those are provide really excellent habitat for bird species. And they're unique, relatively unique in sort of arid Southwest. And you can see, comparing the upper and lower maps, that due to various pressures, their extent has decreased through time. And part of that is that we've confined the channel a little bit. We've done other things to the channel. I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but the point I want to get across is that these features, and there are 3 of them: the Del Val riparian area, what we're calling the Cienega, and then the East Grove, and those have been persistent for a very long time, and will hopefully continue to be. So that's sort of the framework of what the way to think about the basin is, that you have these wet areas with sort of dry areas in between along the river. So the first thing we needed to do was map the groundwater dependent ecosystems in the basin. And we did that based on the plant communities that were mapped. And so we asked what plant communities occur in the Fillmore and Piru basins. Thankfully, Stillwater Sciences has completed a couple of different vegetation maps, one in 2005 and one based on 2016 data that I think was published in 2018 or 19, that we could use to identify the plants and use that mapping to decide which units had the potential to be connected to groundwater. And then we asked, how likely are these plant species to be connected to groundwater? First, by asking how deep are their roots, and then how deep is the groundwater? And so in our first cut, we just used 30 feet. And if the groundwater was within 30 feet of the surface, and the plants could be dependent on groundwater based on what we knew about the species composition, then we called it a GDE. And 30 feet is generally much deeper than the rooting depth of these plants. And so that allows for uncertainties based on where we know data about water, what we know about roots and other things. And then finally, the last thing we do is what is the extent of interconnected surface water, which these areas of rising groundwater that I talked about just previously. So our approach, we generally follow the Nature Conservancy's and DWR's recommended approaches to mapping GDEs. And in that approach, you take the best quality vegetation maps you can get, and these are sort of ordered in order of their quality. And we used the two highest quality in the channel. It's mostly VegCamp, and then sort of outside of the Santa Clara riparian zone, we use CalVeg. We take consideration of hydrology and geology in case there are any faults. We look at groundwater levels where we know them and any other additional local data. And we came up with a map of groundwater dependent ecosystems, which we'll get to in just a minute. This is a map of the different sources we used. The dark green is where the extent of the Stillwater Sciences map. So that goes up most of the Sespe, Piru Creek to almost to the, or it does go all the way up to the dam and to the boundaries, and all the way along the Santa Clara River. And we're outside of that zone, we used CalVeg mapping, which is from 2002. It's a little less detailed and has less species information in general than the Stillwater mapping does. So using that process, we came up with 7 GDE units. How you count them can vary depending on whether you split them at the basin. So you could split them if you divided some of these units at the Fillmore Piru boundary, you would have 9. But we identified 7 GDE units, and I will go through each of them in turn in future slides. But I just wanted to point out that you can see here are our 3 forested wetland complexes, the Del Val, Cienega, and East Grove. And those 3 we know are connected to groundwater. We have 1 unit that may be connected to groundwater, and that's this Santa Clara River riparian shrubland in the pretty gold color. And then we have 3 other units that we've identified on the Sespe, Lake Piru, and then in these other tributaries where we don't have as much information about shallow groundwater. That is groundwater data within the rooting zone of plants. So I'm going to go through these in order. I'll focus on the 4 units along the Santa Clara River, and then at the end I'll talk about the other 3 a little bit. And we'll be working our way downstream. So let's start at the upstream end at the Del Val riparian complex, and this I think of it as a minty green. Each of these plots I'm going to show has, or slides I'm going to show has a plot that shows the 5 most common vegetation types in that GDE unit. So the Del Val unit here is a historical wetland that I talked about a minute ago. It's an area of rising groundwater. It's got Fremont cottonwoods, red willow, and mule fat. And the mule fat occurs at the higher elevations. And it also contains some invasive species, tamarisk and arundo. The rooting depth of the cottonwoods and the willows is something like, the rooting depth literature says that the maximum rooting depth is about 6.7 feet. Our experience in the basin, where we've mapped the elevation at which these plants occur, tells us that they're on average they can have a rooting depth of 10 feet or sometimes up to 15 feet in some cases. And a thing to note about this unit is that effluent releases from Los Angeles County upstream certainly are moving through here, and they may be important for maintaining the GEDE, but that might require some more study. Next is the Cienega riparian complex GDE unit. And we heard about this a month and a half ago, or gosh, was it 2 months ago from Chris Kleber's presentation. This is another historical wetland. It's at the border of the Fillmore and Piru basins. It's an area of rising groundwater. Prior to 2000, the most recent drought, it had extensive cottonwoods and willows, which died during the drought, as Chris showed us in his presentation. And now it has some willows, but it's mostly this mule fat thicket. And mule fat is sort of a shallow rooted, less densely growing plant. It also has a lot of arundo, which is this common giant reed marshes mapping unit. So that's the Cienega. Moving downstream to the what I like to think of as the Mac Daddy GDE unit, which is not a scientific technical term, but sometimes we need to think of things in weird terms to get us through these long COVID days. This is the historical wetland, another area of rising groundwater. It's the most extensive GDE unit in the basin that we're certain is tied to groundwater. And it's made up of a lot of cottonwoods and willows with mule fat at the higher elevations. Moving along, next is this Santa Clara River riparian shrubland. And this is an intermittent section of the stream. That is that these aren't areas of rising groundwater, but when we looked at surfaces of groundwater elevation that United Water had made during during the wettest times of wet years, the groundwater is within 30 feet and it can be relatively shallow within the rooting depths here. The vegetation is primarily these mule fat thickets, which has a very shallow rooting depth. There's some sandbar willows and invasive plants like arundo in it as well. And we think that these units may use groundwater when it's hot, when the groundwater is high, but they're not necessarily sensitive to groundwater management. That is, in the dry summer months, they're relying on probably wetter soil water rather than groundwater. But they do use groundwater. They can use groundwater sometimes. The three other units we identified, the tributary riparian units here in purple, are just riparian units along the edge of the basin. These are mostly oaks, and oaks are known for having very deep roots. They're in these small tributaries that often don't have any groundwater data, certainly not shallow groundwater. And we think these are probably, for the most part, unlikely to be affected by groundwater management. The next is the Sespe Creek riparian, which is up here in the light blue. And this unit does contain cottonwoods, willows, and arundo, which are all generally connected to groundwater. The rooting depths of the willows and cottonwoods is 7 feet, up to 10 feet in our relative elevation, 10 to 15 feet for our relative elevations. But there aren't a lot of groundwater measurements here. And finally, the Piru Creek riparian also has some cottonwoods and willows, a lot of mule fat. It has releases from Santa Felisa Dam at the upstream end, and there's again few shallow groundwater measurements. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through groundwater data for all of the units, and I just wanted to show a couple of different examples to give a feel for what the trends in groundwater are like. You've seen, I think Tony's shown these kinds of plots before. These are plots showing the depth to groundwater here on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And this plot here on the left is the East Grove, as indicated by this red star. And you can see, and I want to mention that this well is probably 10 to 20 feet above the elevation of most of the GDE. It's just outside of the GDE area. So you can see that this well has we don't know a lot about this well. We don't know what the screening depth is of the well, that is where it's connected to the groundwater. But it has a lot of high frequency variations that may or may not be real and aren't really seen in other wells in the basin. But you can see that the groundwater level is pretty, it's pretty full most of the time. And then you have this big drop during the most recent drought. So the groundwater dropped, maybe 20 feet. And there's some indications that it dropped and then came back up and then dropped again. The linkage between the change in groundwater level at this well versus actually in the GDE isn't really known. Judging by how the GDE did during the drought, 20 feet seems like probably an excessive drop. compare that here with the Cienega well. This well is not as, this well is pretty close to the elevation of most of the GDE. And this has a slightly longer record, and you can see you have this period of drops during droughts, then the basin fills up, and then drops again during droughts. And the drop during the most recent drought was pretty significant. It was about 30 feet, and it was that way for some time. There was a slightly larger drop in the 76, in 1976-77 drought. But this drought, our more recent drought, persisted for longer, which probably had some effects on the plants. So, but in the other wells we've looked at, you see the same sort of trend, which is the groundwater basin fills up and it drops during droughts. Then it fills up again. And so it's within the rooting depth, and then during a drought, it goes down. Next, I want to talk about surface water. And I described those 3 units that had that were generally perennial and had surface flow within them. You've seen this plot before. I know Tony has shown it. This was put together by United Water, and here I put on some circles to indicate where the GDU units are. This is Cienega, and this is the East Grove. And where you see a solid line, that is an area of surface water flow. So these are dry season depictions of surface water flow, and shows what happened to the unit through the drought. You can see that in August 2011, you had almost continuous surface water flow from the Cienega coming down Sespe as well. And as the drought began, you can see that extent start to go down. You start to lose the surface water at the Cienega. It sort of keeps going down here in the East Grove and stays in the East Grove through most of the time, and then starts to come back here in November 2017. You can start to see some surface expression of the rising groundwater here at the Cienega, and again at the East Grove is continuing to flow. And so the story here is that similar to the groundwater, during droughts, you see a decline in water, and then it's starting to come back. I don't have any data after November, or any maps after November 10, 2017 to show here. Is there anything else I wanted to say? No. So that's sort of those are the GD units we saw, and they're what's happening with the water that's driving it. And one of the things we wanted to do was track how healthy the GDE was through time, and we do this using a remote sensing technique, that is something measured from aerial photos, in this case taken by satellites, called the Normalized Differential Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And that's essentially just a measure of how green your plants are. The greener they are, the higher the NDVI value, which varies between -1 and 1. And you can see here, this is just an example showing a 0.72, a plant which would have a NDVI of 0.72 is very green. And then as it started to get stressed, as the groundwater level dropped, I kind of imagine this is what the plants in my office, which I haven't seen in a year, look like, or maybe even worse, that they got less green and their NDVI value would decrease. So I'm going to just show some plots of NDVI change through time, and then I'm going to show these in map view in a second for 3 of these examples. So these are kind of wacky plots. I've got one for the East Grove. Cienega is 2. 3 is the upper part of the shrub riparian in the Piru Basin, and 4 is the Del Val riparian complex. And what we've done is calculated an average value of the NDVI each summer growing season, or summer growing season and the dry season, for every GDE unit or every GDE polygon that's been identified within the unit. So here's the East Grove, and every gray line here is a different polygon. The red line is a area weighted average change. So that's telling you in general how the whole GDE is doing. And you can see here's the East Grove riparian complex. And I should say these satellite data go back to 1985, so that's why it starts there. And you can see it's generally increasing. You see some, you see a dip here through the drought, and a slight increase after the drought after you're starting to get some recovery from the drought. But this dip isn't super significant. It's not like a change from that you see in this next one, which is this is the Cienega riparian. This is the Cienega riparian complex, and this is the unit that Chris talked about. I guess it was in January. And you can see this is the NDVI value, and it plummets during the early 90s drought, but then recovers back up within, by 1994 or so. It's kind of at the level it's going to be at for the next few years, until the next drought when it plummeted again. And in this case, it hasn't really recovered yet. And Chris talked about that quite a bit, and it's because a lot of the riparian cottonwoods and willows died. And I'll show an updated plot that goes through 2020 in a second. This riparian shrubland here in the Piru, you see some maybe small dips during the drought here in the early 90s, some peaks surrounding higher flows, which sort of refresh the surface and allow new vegetation to come in, and also allow a lot of the underbrush to come in. But notice that these values are somewhere around 0.2 to 0.3, which is something like half the value of the East Grove. So it's much less dense vegetation, and not a big decline during the drought, partially because that vegetation is not very dense. The pixel size of these techniques is something like 30 meters, so it's averaging the greenness over 30 meter pixel. Lastly, the Del Val riparian complex up here. And you can see it's pretty steady. You had a drop after the flood during the 2005 flood, and a small drop maybe at the end of the drought. And I'll talk more about where that is in about 3 slides. So that's sort of our health through time. The East Grove doing pretty well. The Cienega seems much more sensitive than the East Grove or the Del Val. And we'll keep going on here. So here's the Del Val, and I switched the order from these in the presentation that was posted because I realized I need to think about this going downstream. So here's the Del Val riparian zone, and what the bottom plot shows you you just take those plots of the GDE for each pixel through time, the NDVI, and then you just fit a curve through it. You just fit a line, and if the line is increasing, that's going to be blue, and if the line is decreasing, it's going to be red. So this is the slope of the change in NDVI, and this is from 2011 through 2020. This is processed using Google Earth Engine. And so you can see that the Del Val riparian complex, at least the upper half of it, is mostly reds with a little bit of, or mostly blues with a little bit of red on the edges, but it's mostly blue. So that means that it's generally increasing. But as you get to the downstream end of the unit, it becomes much more red. That sort of makes sense if you think about an area where you've got rising groundwater coming in at the upstream end, and you can imagine that what happens during the drought is that area of rising groundwater shrinks a little bit. And so the edges is where we would expect to see the change. The Cienega, comparing to the last one, here's the Cienega at the boundary of the Fillmore and Piru basins. And you can see that it's mostly just red. And so there's some blue out here in these areas that were pretty sparse to begin with. But this is, Chris talked about this again, and it's mostly just an area it's mostly an area where most of the plants died. And you can see a lot of this brown up here. And the groundwater here dropped quite a lot. Finally, if you look at the East Grove, you can see that it's a much different story. It's much redder for most of it, or much bluer for most. Gosh, I can't even It's bad enough that I sometimes get left and right confused, but here I'm doing red and blue. It's much bluer, meaning that it's done much better. There are some changes at the upstream end. There's some red along here, but I think that you'll notice that that's mostly where the channel is. So that's just a function of how the channel has shifted a little bit through time and the amount of vegetation growing there. But for the most part, it's been relatively healthy. Okay, and now I've just got a couple more slides of special status species, and I am just running behind time, and I think a little bit, and I apologize. So special status species, what plants and birds and fish are occurring in the basin. So I'm going to start off with my errata slide that I added. So due to a copy and paste error that was not the fault of our very smart fisheries biologists, but was the fault of someone copying and pasting and deciding to split up a table, someone whose name starts with Christian. And I copied something from one place and I shouldn't have, and I said that there were Pacific lamprey that were documented to occur in the Piru, and that's not to our knowledge, that's not true. So that's something that that's been corrected in the document already. And I just wanted to get that out there. And this is just as a light moment. I was looking for a picture of Lamprey Day, and I came across this cool thing in Wikipedia that says the common name lamprey is probably derived from the Latin lampetra, which means stone liquor. And because lambere is to lick and petra is stone. And that just about made my day. So back to special status species. This is just a list of the groundwater dependent plants, the numbers of plants, wildlife, fish, and sensitive natural communities that occur in the basin, in the two basins. So we have 5 special status plants, 11 sensitive natural communities, 10 wildlife, and 4 fish species, and that were identified as either being indirectly dependent on groundwater, which means that they need to live in trees that are connected to groundwater, or directly dependent on groundwater. And so we used this in the latter part of the document when we were talking about this sort of ecological value of each of these different units. And as you know, the East Grove has as much of as anything. The areas of rising groundwater end up being pretty important. I also want to point out this critical habitat mapped by the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS for 4 different species in the basin. This little red dot here is where the extent of California condor and the basin boundaries coincide. Otherwise, so they're not it's just, I think, a trick of where the basins were drawn. Otherwise, the purplish line here is the Southern California steelhead as identified by NIPS. Leesbell's vireo is the green here, doing really well in the Del Val, and the Southwest Willard flycatcher has critical habitat along most of the Santa Clara. Okay, so in summary, we identified 7 GDE units in the Fillmore and Piru basins, and the GD units at the basin boundaries, the Del Val, Cienega, and East Grove riparian complexes were all areas of rising groundwater and perennial flow. The groundwater-dependent vegetation included willows, cottonwoods, and exotic species like arundo. The rooting depth of willows and cottonwoods is somewhere between 7, 10, maybe up to 15 feet. Groundwater elevations declined during the droughts to below the rooting depth of GDEs. Rising groundwater did not occur after 2013 in the Cienega riparian complex, and we saw a big decline there. And we also saw declines at the upstream margin of the East Grove and the downstream margin of the Del Val. The groundwater elevation of the Cienega riparian complex dropped 30 feet, which is much deeper than the rooting zone would be. NDVI decline during the late 80s and early 90s drought was similar to 2012 to 2016 in the Cienega riparian complex, but NDVI recovered within a couple of years in the early 90s. And 19 groundwater dependent special status species are likely to occur in the basins. And I'm happy to take your questions after when we get to question time. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Christian. Do we have any questions on that presentation? Any points of clarification?
So Christian, with regards to the impact at Cespi Cienega, do you make any what's the word, conclusions? Because I know there weren't conservation releases from Santa Felicia Dam in some of those years that correlate to the considerable die-off, or are you making any assumptions or around, is it conservation release related? Is it purely drought related? Is it pumping related?
We are not making it's hard for us to piece those different pull those different things apart. We do know that the groundwater dropped a lot there, and that groundwater drop was probably significant enough to cause the die-off.
Yeah.
The degree to which that could have been, especially stuff on the edge, could have been maintained by releases, I don't know. That starts getting into something kind of tricky. And then as far as the effect of pumping, that's more of a question for Tony about the degree to which pumping might have affected those groundwater elevations, because he knows that much better than I do.
Christian, I've got a related question for the Cienega returning complex. Tony, were you going to answer? Did you have something, or can I go ahead? I hope I didn't cut you off.
No, go ahead.
So on the NDVI map, you know, the Cienega riparian complex, and it looks like the most red is where the main channel of the river used to go, which was more in the central location. Now, I think it's shifted to the south of that now.
Yeah.
Which seems to show yellow and kind of light blue. So is part of what happened there due to the shifting main channel flow there?
Well, I would say that channel's probably shifted historically all the time. Let me see if I can't show that slide.
If it shifted during a critical time, then any conservation releases or any other releases wouldn't be where most of the larger tree species were, I think.
Potentially that's true. I mean, I sort of see that whole western part of the whole northern part of the Cienega is where the area of rising groundwater is. And if you had a shift of the channel, I still think that valley would stay that the western part of the valley would stay kind of wet, and that could have some effect on it for sure. We do see these changes after floods, and like that change in the East Grove is, I think, pretty clearly a movement of the channel, at least at the upstream end. And so that could be part of it. I don't think that's the whole story. I feel like that the groundwater declines there, and the lack of surface water flows as well tells you that it's not just that the channel shifted, it's that the water level dropped.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. I saw a similar pattern in the East Grove where the channel shifted. There seemed to be the most reduction in the NDVI index, and it was strongest.
Yes.
The channel shifted too. There was a pretty major shift in the channel in the 2005 flood. In fact, there were some very large changes. Like, I'm next to the river, so I see it.
That's right. Yeah, okay. and you know that you do see after the flood. I mean, the thing is that after the flood, the big trees changed. But one of the things that happened after the flood is that it was so wet that all these little green plants grew everywhere. And Bruce has these really nice sequences slides that show that by the late summer, everything was green along the channel there. even in the areas that had recently flooded. It just sort of got cleared of vegetation and then it grew back very quickly.
Yeah.
And you see that in, excuse me, in the weighted average mean over time from 2005 to up until the time of the drought, you were seeing, this gradual increase in NDVI. And I think a lot of that is, establishment and regrowth and expansion of vegetation after that 2005 El Nino reset.
So Bruce, to follow up to that, when Christian presented to the environmental group, he said they didn't quite tease out native veg and arundo, will also come up as green in the NDVI. And I'm just wondering to
well,
what
when it's healthy, but during the drought, like around Sesame Cienega, you see this, apparent dieback, whether it's a true dieback or just desiccation of the arundo. It is reflected in decreasing NDVI. So
I'm referring more to with the regeneration after the drought.
Yeah, so that's actually a good point because often arundo is ahead of the natives in terms of responding after the drought. So it's an indication of changes in conditions that would support native vegetation. So in terms of that change in NDVI and greenness, in terms of GDE potential, it's a good indicator. But obviously the habitat value of arundo is vastly different from the natives.
If it's an invasive plant, why are we giving it credit when we try to pay to remove it?
I don't think we're giving it credit. We're just it's just there. We're not, it's not, if we have maps of where the arundo is, and the things we're concerned about, the thing that I think it's Bruce, who is an amazing ecologist up in the morning, is what's happening to the willows and cottonwoods. Like that's really, that gets his heart fluttering, and the arundo less so.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that, because my understanding was that we're really concerned about what you stated in the very beginning of the slide, was those with root structures 30 feet or more. And I thought that was the East Grove was really where we want to make sure, but I didn't think there was others that we were concerned of. And so when you say that we're talking about arundo, I think invasive and we want it out of there.
No, I mean, and I think there are a lot of I mean, Bruce can speak to this better than I can, but there are a lot of active restoration projects happening right now that are trying to do something about that. And but they are, when you're looking at this GDE as a whole, it's mostly about where the groundwater depth is shallow, and the potential, the places that are growing arundo would also be good potential places for the most part for willows and cottonwoods, right? And so if you're thinking about the ecosystem as a whole, those are sort of areas that we would like to have become willows and cottonwoods eventually,
but were they there to begin with 100 years ago? I only ask because we have to look at the before and after and really understand that.
Yeah. So I guess to answer that question, the areas of primary concentration of arundo are in those areas that were historically, forested wetland complexes. So what Kristen was saying, you definitely get some arundo scattered in, sparser stands in the transitional areas, but where you're getting the dense, lush arundo stands, it's typically in those areas that historically supported the native cottonwood willow forests. And so the arundo in that sense is an indicator of the ecological potential, although the current value is greatly reduced because arundo's there.
Well, unfortunately, if you look at the maps that you're sharing now, if you look at the thicker area of the Cienega, which would be to the right of the label, where it's thickest north to south, to the right.
The right is, was I doing my thing wrong? The left and right?
The other right. I think if you look at overheads and look at that from a distance, unfortunately, it's pretty thick with arundo right there right now. Yeah. I think it's the dominant species other than mule fat right in that area.
Yeah, but I mean, that is an area that's in the midst of active arundo removal right now, and then there's a grant in there for restoration, both on the CDFW's fish hatchery, sort of Cienega restoration site, and on the adjacent Nature Conservancy property that we're talking about here. There are plans to try to get in there, post Arundel removal to revegetate it with natives. But that is the area that saw this huge die-off of willows in particular during the drought. That reminds me, another complication of trying to tease apart these causal factors in this area in particular is the drought coincided with the fish hatchery shutting down for a while. So that greatly changed the surface water outflows from the fish hatchery, and probably, exacerbated the drought effects due to that loss of water. Plus there was the change in the watercress farming in that area as CDFW took over ownership.
And this figure here shows the extent of Arundel from Stillwater's 2016 mapping. Arundel and Tamarisk is the sort of less common, darker red.
I'm surprised it's not more. Another question, going back to the table that you showed showing groundwater dependent special status species.
Yes.
I think you mentioned that there were 5 groundwater dependent plant species, and I just wanted to be sure I understood which ones those are.
Let me, this is going to require my report. Hold on.
Well, are they the same species that are on page 40 of the GDE tech memo?
Let me get there and make sure that I'm not going to lie to you. Yeah, but I would think so. Yeah.
I think there are 6 species there, but
yeah. Page
I'm wondering,
4. Yeah.
I'm wondering, just since we're getting a little over time, would it be possible to look those up and put the answer in the chat box during Tony Morgan's presentation? Would that work?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'll be curious to see that because there's a series of questions I have that are tied to that, but we'll wait
to
keep going here.
Okay. And I'll leave it to the board if you want to keep going. I just wanted to make sure we had enough time to get the stakeholder input later, and we have a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
So
I have
let me know if you want to keep.
One more question about the presentation, Lisa. I can come back to me or however you want to handle it.
Sure.
Yeah, because Lisa, I did get comprehensive input from the Nature Conservancy, and I don't think it would be helpful for the meeting to go through those one by one. Is it best to share that with Tony Morgan and Stillwater Sciences for them to address, or do you want? How do you want to?
Yeah, I think the focus of today was really to try to get some feedback on the sustainable management criteria, and clearly this relates to that. But if these are detailed comments about the GDE technical report, I think that it would make sense to send them directly to Tony and Christian if they don't pertain to the criteria. But when we get to the criteria, if those are relevant, then that would be a good time to bring that up.
You know, we would, if I could add on any kind of comments, we'd like for the agency to be able to capture those. So, you know, I would like to have Eva probably copied on any of the, you know, if you send something, Candace, that we can capture that as a comment. So we'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Right, because we definitely need to make sure that all comments are public access as well to capture that for stakeholder engagement.
Thank you. And then we just have a few quick questions in the chat box that I just didn't want to ignore. Similarly about the Arundel, there's a question about why it's being referred to as exotic instead of invasive. Terminology question, I guess. Dan Detmer was clarifying, I think, suggesting a clarification that there were 7 potential GDE areas with riparian vegetations, but not all were determined or considered to be GDEs. And then we had a question, how does the NDVI inform the analysis as Arundel cannot be separated using the index? I think you've addressed that a little bit.
Right.
If I'm not mistaken. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we have looked close, just to address that question quickly. We have looked a little bit at comparing the vegetation maps and the change in the NDVI, but it's like trying to make a figure of that is really crazy because there's like so many different vegetation types that you end up having a legend that's bigger than a page. But we have looked at that as well. Yeah.
Okay, super. And then one last quick question from Brian Bondi regarding Duval. Christian mentioned retreat of rising groundwater. Could this also be related to changes in discharges from the upstream wastewater treatment plant?
And that's a question for DBSNA, I think, in terms of
Okay.
the source of those changes.
Okay, so let's turn it over then to Tony Morgan for the presentation on the draft sustainable management criteria.
So Lisa, will we be able to come back and ask questions during the comment period on this presentation?
Yeah, and you know what, it's up to, I want to leave it up to the board how you want to use the time tonight. Clearly, if you feel it's worthwhile to spend more time commenting on the technical memo, just know that it takes away from the stakeholder input session that we had planned, unless you want to let the meeting go longer. So I leave it to you, but just giving you a flag.
Actually, what would be really good also is public to know where to send their comments, because they're going to hear this information right now and they're going to, you know, turn the video off and think of some other questions, and we want to make sure we capture them. So where would they need to send them? Can someone put it in the chat or say it right now, the email?
I feel that what we've been, I said for all the public comments, we've generally been directing them to go through Eva. So would that work to have these go through her as well? And then she'll funnel them to Tony and we'll send them to Christian. Would that work?
Okay, can someone tell everybody Eva's contact information?
Hey, Eva, you want to put that in the chat box when I get a moment?
Thank you.
Thanks.
How much time did we set aside for the talking about the technical versus the sustainable management criteria?
So we were hoping to wrap up all the presentations by 6:30 so that we'd have an hour for stakeholder input.
Okay.
So we're getting, we're about 15 minutes behind or so.
Okay, then if it's okay with directors, I would like to continue with the presentation and write down your questions so that once we get through the other presentation, we can absorb and then ask those questions if that's okay, based on time. I'm hearing head nods, thumbs ups, yes. So thank you, Lisa, for trying to keep us on time here. Lots of good questions coming out from everybody. Go ahead.
Evening, directors, and staff, and all the stakeholders who've joined us this evening. Thank you for giving some of your free time away to be a part of this. So tonight we're going to talk about sustainable management criteria, and there's going to be a summary of many of the presentations, the conversations at recent board meetings, the previous stakeholder workshops, and ad hoc committee discussions. So many of you will recognize some of the slides if you've attended these events. And this presentation assumes that everyone has participated in those events or has taken the opportunity to review the recordings that are on the agency's website. So we'll move through some of these fairly rapidly for the sake of time and allowing maximum amount of opportunity for people to make comments. We'll start out by taking a quick look at the draft SMC matrix. Not going to go through it in painful detail, but I wanted everyone to understand what we're trying to create through this process. The matrix contains the recent input offered by the directors at the last board meeting. We'll go through the rationale for each of the SMCs in a somewhat abbreviated format. And we'll spend a little more time on the surface water depletion sustainability indicator. So we've got a little more information to share with you there. And then we'll revisit the matrix at the end after we've got this extra context that we've gained from hearing this presentation. So here's the sustainability matrix. It's just a quick way of compiling the critical elements of how sustainability will be defined in the Fillmore and the Piru basins. The general organization of the matrix has the sustainable management indicators down the left-hand column. That's groundwater elevation, storage reduction, etc. And it's followed immediately to the right by the undesirable results. Those are the things that you're trying to avoid happening in your basin. Okay, the metric column tells you how you're going to measure that SMC. Okay, and it's important to remember that the undesirable results are defined as when they are significant and unreasonable impacts that occur. And what's a significant and unreasonable impact? SGMA allows that to be defined by the GSA agency itself with input from the stakeholders. So the MT, the minimum threshold column there, is a descriptor of when significant and unreasonable impacts happen. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the MO, the measurable objective. It's a goal. Think of it as a desired future condition if you want to. And compliance with these will be assessed at representative wells or points distributed across the basin. It's not necessarily to monitor an SMC at every possible location in the basin. Remember, a GSP is an overall basin sustainability goal document. It's not an environmental impact report related, but it's at the basin scale rather than the local project scale. Excuse me. So let's jump through each of the indicators pretty rapidly, and let's start with the easiest one, seawater intrusion. It's not really a realistic concern for these two basins. We're far enough inland and at an elevation above sea level that we don't expect seawater intrusion to be an issue. If seawater intrusion becomes an issue here, we have a whole lot of other things we need to worry about rather than this. Water quality degradation. This is an interesting indicator. The SGMA regulations and the DWR guidelines, interestingly, want the GSA to monitor how the implementation of your plan could impact water quality, but they don't give you the authority to enforce water quality regulations. So lacking the ability to enforce the water quality regulations makes setting of the measurable objective problematic. You're not the one that gets to set what the desired future conditions are. Other regulatory agencies are doing that. So the agency would be in an awkward position if it contended that it could achieve a certain water quality goal, but really didn't have the authority to enforce water quality regulations. So the suggested approach here is for the agency to set your MTs at the values established by the regulatory entities. There are a variety of them, county, EPA, the state, all have various water quality values there. And then you're going to be a cooperating entity with those organizations that do have the authority. So you're not, for example, let's take the chloride issues that we talk about frequently coming from wastewater plant discharges in the Santa Clarita area. So you as an agency don't have the ability to control that, but you can monitor it. You can determine via your monitoring program if and when it's becoming an issue for you, and then you can raise that issue with the appropriate regulatory agencies who do have the authority to regulate water quality. So you become a cooperating entity with that regulatory agency because you don't, as an agency, don't have the authority to fix it yourself. So let's talk about groundwater levels. We'll spend a little more time on this one, setting the context for it. DWR is particularly concerned about long-term chronic groundwater level decline. They don't want to see situations where the water levels continue to decline decade over decade. Okay? They also want you to take a look at what are the impacts of water level declines on beneficial uses and users. Okay? And so that's groundwater extractions by municipal irrigation or domestic wells, for example. It's related to surface water depletion. Beneficial users and uses are also a part of the GDE conversation as well. And so our evaluation process looked at the long-term future water conditions and including the effects of climate change. So you've seen this slide before. SGMA requires groundwater basins to strive to reach that self-defined condition of sustainability, in this case for Fillmore and Piru basins, by 2042. In addition, the GSP must show that the sustainability condition extends for another 30 years beyond that 2042 milestone. So to simulate these future conditions, we needed to create a future climate framework. What do we think the climate in the future is going to look like? We worked with the United Water Conservation District hydrologists and modelers to define a future climate scenario based on the historical range of precipitation. Ultimately, we settled on a future climate, a precipitation, if you will, that included the early to mid 1940s drought and extended through 2019. So the process is to pick up that precipitation record from 1943 to 2019 and append it on to the current record. So append it on to 2019 and repeat that sequence. Okay, so we picked up the years from 1943 going to 2019, and we appended it on here. And so you'll see this is your future estimated climate conditions. So we wanted to make sure that we captured all of the range. And so we went with this extra long period of climate on here and ran it out all the way out to 2096. It's important to understand that this set of information right here is not predictive. By that, I mean, if we come in here and what's this year right here? There's 27, 20, 29. So in 2029, we are not predicting that there's going to be 37 inches of water. That's not how you use this. What we're using this for is to capture the range of precipitation values and the trends that have happened historically. And we're assuming that those trends are going to be similar in the future. When they occur exactly is up in the air. But if they occur, we want to make sure that we've taken a look at how the basins would respond to those conditions. How does the basin respond when we've got a drought? How does the basin respond when we're in a wet period? What does climate change do to these things? So DWR has suggested some climate change factors. For example, how is precipitation expected to change that you overlay on the precipitation record? And so if we take a look at 2005, let's look right here. Here's 2005. Okay, and so we're just a smidge over 40 inches of rain. But if we come out and find the analogous period out here, we come to this point and we look at it and it says, oh, the future climate change suggested that that year might be 50 inches of rain. Okay, so that's what the climate change factors do. They don't tell you how much precipitation is going to occur in a year. They tell you what the change factor is, how much to increase or decrease the precipitation in a particular year. Again, these aren't predictive. We're just getting the maximum range of conditions and seeing how the basins will respond. Okay, and so this precipitation record is then dropped into the groundwater flow model, and we use that to help see how those basins will respond. So you've seen these graphs before. We always look at the cumulative departure of precipitation. And this is an important thing for you just to recognize that while we talk very frequently about, hey, we're in a wet period and a dry period, and we're talking about a few years, we can also see that there are bigger climatic cycles here. We see long-term drying periods flattening out, and then the periods become wetter. We also see periods where, hey, we tried to recover here. We got some above average wet years. We tried to recover, but then we went back into a drought period. And so this is a very important thing to recognize. One of the things that happens when we picked up the 1943 time period and carried it forward is we ended up with a period right here of the mid 1940s drought. Okay. And that is a 7-year drought. There's 7 years in a row where we had below average precipitation. So over the historical record of precipitation, which goes back to about 1928 in this part of the world, okay, this has happened exactly once. Okay, that we have a 7-year sequence of below average. We've gotten to 5 a few times. 3 is fairly common. Okay, but a 7-year sequence is a pretty severe drought. So we made sure that this was included in the evaluations of it when we talked about water levels. How low could we go if we repeated this possible but infrequently experienced climatic sequence? Okay, let's just keep on going for the instance of time. So one of the things we can do when we have a powerful tool like the groundwater flow model that United has created for us, we can take a look and see what the future groundwater levels look like at the wells across the basin. How low are they going to go in the future based on all the assumptions that are included in the model? And so when we looked at this, we found that there were no production wells that were expected to go dry in the future modeling scenario right there. There were 9 wells that, if you looked at the modeling data, suggested that they might go dry. And in this instance, going dry, we've defined as having the water level fall below the base of the well screen. Okay, but when we go back and manually look at the water levels here, we find out that maybe the model is under predicting under predicting the water levels in those wells, and it's not likely that they're going to go dry. So the conclusion is that there's no production wells expected to go dry during the future climatic conditions as summarized in the groundwater flow model. We do have some monitoring wells that go dry. Those are generally, a lot of them are shallower. And so there are some of those that go dry, but in the overall spectrum of trying to look at how it affects potable or irrigation supplies, we're not seeing a big impact in the future. So I thought it'd be interesting to quickly run through a few of the wells. You've seen some of these before, and just looking at what does the historical record look in this well. Here's the predicted from the groundwater model. That's the line there, and the sort of, I guess that's kind of turquoise colored dots right there on my screen. Those are the actual measurements, and then the orangish colored curves here are what the groundwater flow model is predicting to happen at that particular well. So the key takeaway here on these series of slides, as you're going to see, is that there's no evidence of chronic decline of water levels. They do go down during a drought. They come back up when it's wet. They go down in droughts. They come back up when it's wet. That's just a series that's gone on in these basins probably forever. Okay. So the other thing that's interesting to note here is that the range of values that we see in the future climate scenarios are not that much different. The mins and maxes are not that much different than what we see in the historical record. So you can see the lows and the highs right here pretty much are similar to each other. So we can just keep on walking through. Here's kind of the Bardsdale area. You can see during droughts, water levels fall. They come back up during wet periods. Here's that 1940s drought effect on water levels. You can see here it comes back up. And again, no evidence of chronic decline of water level. One more up in the Piru area. The shaded area here indicates top of the well screen, just for reference purposes. So we're seeing pretty much the same thing, maybe a little bit deeper here during that unique event of the 7-year drought sequence right there, but pretty much the similar pattern as we're seeing on all the wells here. Excuse me, heavy finger there. Here we go. Right at the boundary between the two basins. Similar pattern, droughts, wet periods. Got a little deeper here during the 1940s analogous drought period. But other than that, no evidence of chronic decline of water levels. And one more, moving over in the Piru area, we see a similar thing. Mins and max almost identical in this particular instance. And no evidence of chronic decline. Okay. Storage. So one of the main things that we talk about with storage is that we have enough groundwater in storage to last through a future drought. We need to tide ourselves over until we can get to that next wet period and the basin can replenish itself. That might be 3 years, 5 years, and we saw historically it could be as long as 7 years. Okay. Storage is a critical element for these basins because we're so dependent on groundwater. We don't have surface water supplies to depend on. So it's groundwater that gets us through the droughts. So let's look at forecasted cumulative change in storage. These are the two bottom graphs right here. Pumping for the two basins is in the upper graphs. So here's Fillmore. So we see storage declines during the late 1940s drought period right here. So we've got a decade or so where storage is depleted, but it comes back up during the wet period. Again, there's a drought, it recovers. Here's the most recent drought again that we've replicated. Similar pattern. Looks very, very similar. The magnitudes, the ups and downs are different, obviously, in the Piru Basin, but it's a very same thing. So there's not a situation where we're foreseeing, based on the future modeling, that we're in a situation where the future is going to say there's going to be a lot less water in groundwater storage than what we've experienced in the past. Okay, subsidence. In the Sigma regulations, we're talking about groundwater subsidence due to groundwater extractions only. It is possible to get subsidence associated with oil and gas extractions and that kind of thing, but we're only dealing with groundwater extractions for the purposes here. A couple of overarching things there is that there's no anecdotal evidence of historical subsidence, even with those drought-induced low water levels that we saw in the past. Future groundwater conditions are not likely to be low enough to trigger subsidence. So if you were attending some of the last couple of board meetings, you saw that there's a tech memo on the agency's website. So if you'd like to look at it and see a little bit more of the technical data there, that's certainly available for you to peruse. But one of the things we talked about doing was implementing and using the INSAR data, the satellite-based measurements that DWR is going to provide, at least for the next few years, at no cost to the agency, to monitor what's going on with the subsidence, the ups and downs of the land surface in the basin. And so we picked just 8 different areas across the basin to illustrate what's going on, and then you'll see a plot of the entire basin there. So INSAR data has a minimum resolution. You can only see so small of a set of units of movement. And so 0.05 and minus 0.05 are kind of the range. Anything within those gray bands you see right there is below the minimum resolution of the technology. We see, and a value can be calculated, but I wouldn't suggest that we necessarily make management decisions based on those things that are within the, maybe calling them noise is a little too strong, but it's below the minimum resolution that the researchers recommend. One thing we're going to talk about on the next slide is the Central Piru Basin. We've talked about this before. And so we see here that there's an area where, if you look at the scale over here, the legend, that actually the ground surface is rising. And so that's an effect likely of the spreading of large amounts of surface water from either releases from Santa Felicia, or maybe it's Article 21 purchases that came down through Castaic. Okay, and we had a situation where we had some elastic rebound associated with spreading large amounts of water. And so it pretty much coincides with when the releases were occurring. And we know quite clearly that a lot of water infiltrates into the Piru Basin when we do those releases. So around that area, you see the gray, and the gray tint right there indicates it's within the air bar of the INSAR technology. So we've got this technology to monitor the entire basin. We can look anywhere we want and get some fairly small scale resolution. I think, I always get this confused. I think it's the INSAR data is on 100-meter grids across. So it's a fairly small grid covering the entire area. So one of the conditions that's necessary for subsidence to occur is that we have to have low water levels, and low water levels that are below anything that we've historically seen in the basin. So if the basin has experienced, if the sediments have experienced, to give the sediments a personal personalization, that they can actually experience something. They've seen water levels that low, then if they were going to compact and subside, they should have already done it. So until we get water levels that are below those low levels, then we don't anticipate that subsidence would be an issue. So we did an evaluation of looking at how low the historical water levels were compared to what we have in our current more recent historical record, like the 1985 through 2019 water levels. And so as we go back in time, we have fewer and fewer wells that have records back to the 30s, 40s, et cetera. But when we looked at those records that we do have, it seemed like that compared to the current historic low, like the 2016 low water level, the estimated historical lows, and we'll use that terminology, is about 20 feet lower than what was experienced in 2016. So that becomes our benchmark that we're using. And so what we did is we picked 4 wells that you can see right here, and they're color coded, and those color codes associate with this graph right here. And we compared the forecasted, the simulated water levels that are expected to occur in the future in these wells from the groundwater flow model with what the estimated historical low is. And so we see here's the low points and here's the estimated historical low. So it's not evident that we're going to get to the estimated historical low on most of these wells. We kind of touch it right here, but for a very small period of time. And that's the sort of yellow colored well. Let's go back to that. So that's right here at the basin boundary, and you'll see why that's important in just a moment. So for all of these 4 representative wells there, we don't see a massive indication that the water levels in the future are expected to be so low due to climate change or whatever that we're going to have the conditions right to initiate subsidence. So we decided to take a look and say, well, that's 4 wells, but what about the rest of the wells in the basin? Did we just pick the 4 best ones by accident, or are there others that we should look at? And so here's a map looking at all the wells across the basins, and we see that it's generally the red dots cluster here at the basin boundary. That's where it's likely that we're going to get close to or slightly below the estimated historical low in those areas. But what we also noticed in the data is that those historical lows are exceeded maybe 1 month, maybe 2 months. It's not like there's a prolonged period of time there that we would think would be a necessary element of inducing subsidence to occur. So as we move away from the basin boundaries, then you see that the distance between the estimated historical low and the modeled low is there's more and more of a buffer. So there's no real indication to think that we're going to initiate the conditions necessary to start subsidence into the future based on these modeling data. Okay, so we had sort of a summary table. Overall, again, I'm not going to go through all of this. We thought the subsidence potential was low in the Fillmore, very low in Piru, and the difference between those two is function of the hydrostratigraphy, the presence of more fine-grained sediments in Fillmore than in Piru. So there's nothing more to add to the subsidence area here. So surface water and groundwater interaction, an interesting thing, and we've batted this around and chewed on this probably for 3 or 4 board meetings and workshop events and approaching it from the left and right and top and bottom and trying to figure out an approach. And so I wanted to give you an update on where we are with the current thinking, and this is what's included in the sustainability matrix. So we're looking at surface water depletion due to groundwater extractions. That's the focus of what DWR is asking us to address. Okay, we need to look at impacts of any water level declines on beneficial uses and users, so GDEs, surface water diversions, and those kinds of things. And I wanted to focus on the 2 areas that we heard Christian talk about earlier, the Cienega area, and I sort of broadened that area a little bit and called it the fish hatchery area. So the fish hatchery is right in that part of the world. And then the Willard Road area, which is the eastern area. And so Willard Road is about right there. And these correspond to places where United Water's hydrologists do surface water measurements. That's where they gauge the stream. So there are only a few points along the river where we have a strong data set of surface water measurements. And so the hydrologists at United developed an empirical relationship between the water level in a particular well and their measured surface water flow at 2 locations. Okay, and those wells are here in red, and the other one's just off the screen here to the right. And so we come up with this mathematical relationship for the fish hatchery area. Here you can see that relationship, and we've got a formula, nice R squared on it. Willard Road, same thing, nice R squared on that value as well. So what that does is it gives us the ability to look at a water level in a particular well, in our well that we have this empirical relationship, and then use that mathematical function to estimate what the surface water flow would be through that. So as we go forward in time, we can use that mathematical relationship to estimate what surface water flow would be at those 2 points along the river into the future with future groundwater levels. Okay, let's see. So one of the things that we wanted to look at is to estimate the impacts of pumping on surface water flow. And both of these areas are dominated by rising groundwater. It's not surface water flow that's coming from points upstream necessarily. Of course, it does that during storm events and things like that when there's lots of runoff, or there's releases from Santa Felicia or maybe potentially from Castaic coming downstream during, for example, Article 21 releases. So the majority of the time, there's a dry reach upstream. So when we get to the Willard Road and or the fish hatchery area, we're talking about rising groundwater providing the surface water at those locations. And so we asked United in there to help us effectively address what is the effect of surface water, of pumping on surface water flows. And basically it's the rising groundwater. We asked them to turn off the pumping in the wells that are within approximately a mile of the river, just to see what kind of impact we would have. And so in the slide you see here, the blue dots are the ones that were turned off when they did that modeling effort. Now, one of the things we did not do is we did not go back then and say, oh, well, we need to maintain the same level of pumping in each of those basins. So let's take that pumping from the blue colored wells and distribute it to the other wells. We did not do that. So there's an overall decrease in the amount of pumping that went on in the basins. But I think it's enough to give us an idea of what's going on. So zoom in a little bit. This is what we call the Willard Road area. Here's Willard Road right here. This is the Santa Paula and the Fillmore Basin boundary right here. That's Santa Paula over here. And so we're talking about a surface water sampling point that's out in this part of the world. And that's what we're going to look at next. So remember, we've got that mathematical relationship. We can use that mathematical relationship and crank it through based on the future water levels that are derived from the groundwater model. And we can estimate what the rising groundwater is at that particular point on the ground. So we can see 2 curves here. The sort of brown colored curve here, the upper one is the no pumping. That's where we turned off the wells. The blue dots, if you remember, were turned off. Okay, and then the gray line there represents with pumping, the normal situation that we have there. And so what do we see? We see that there is an impact. Okay, groundwater extractions do decrease the rate of rising groundwater, but they don't totally eliminate it, even during the future climate change scenario as prescribed by DWR. It doesn't totally deplete it. Okay. During non-drought conditions, the difference between the with and without pumping rates is typically in the 5 to 10 CFS, cubic feet per second range. During droughts, the difference is a similar range. It's not a whole lot different. So what does this tell us? It tells us that during the droughts and into the future, Rising groundwater is expected to continue at this point along the Santa Clara River, even during the droughts. And this eliminates the potential that we need to go the next step and say, well, how low would the water levels fall in this area, and would that affect vegetation? Because we're showing that rising groundwater is never totally depleted here. It's reduced for certain, but is it totally depleted? No, it's not. Okay. Christian went through this, and so I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time, but you heard his explanation, and they were totally spot on how the reaches are flowing, and then as the drought progresses, we see those become a little more segmented. Certain pieces become intermittent, and they get smaller and smaller with time. So those wetted reaches shrink. Okay, they begin to shrink within 2 to 3 years, and many of them are probably dry within a 5 to 6 year kind of a drought period. Okay, so we can move on to the rising groundwater near the fish hatchery. It's a little more complicated scenario here, and Christian alluded to that earlier. So we've got the boundary here between Fillmore and Piru Basins. Fish hatchery area is here, and so we're going to talk about what goes on with rising groundwater in this part of the world. So graph is a little more complicated. It takes a few more moments to digest what we're looking at here. So we've got the brown line again, meaning no pumping. We turned off the blue dotted wells, as we said earlier. Gray meaning the pumping is continuing as normal. And so what do we see? We see during wet periods when the water level is high, okay, there is still some loss of water, but it's generally less than 10 CFS there. The amount of rising groundwater is much greater. So it's more than 50 up here during these peaks. Okay, it's much higher than it was at Willard Road. The other thing we note is that the curves do hit zero. There are periods where there is no rising groundwater at this location. And we notice when we look at periods during the droughts is when it's the biggest issue. So here's the late 1980s drought. And so we had a period of time right here with pumping, that's the gray line, where there was no rising groundwater. Okay, but without pumping, there was very few months where there wasn't at least some rising groundwater there. Okay, so we're saying that there is an impact from pumping on the rising groundwater at this particular point in time, but that impact is most severe in the drought periods, as we would expect. Okay, nothing unusual there. And so if we look at the amount of time over this long span of decades here, how many months have zero rising groundwater? Well, with pumping, without pumping, excuse me, it's about 9% of the time, and with pumping, it's about 28% of the time. But the thing to remember is that the bulk of this period where it's zero rising groundwater are focused right in this time period where we've superimposed the 7-year 1940s like drought. That's where we see the bulk of it. In a more, I'll call it typical drought, if you will, like the one we recently came out of. Yep, there's some months and time period there where it's zero for sure. The smaller droughts, we don't get down to there, or we get barely to it. Okay, and so the frequency and the length of that drought period is much smaller, of course, and so we don't see as many months where it's zero. So this is again, this is not predictive. This just is telling us if the basin were to experience these kinds of conditions again in the future, this is how it might respond. If we look at the historical period versus the future period, we don't see a whole lot of difference in the amount of change in the rising groundwater. So what we did is we calculated what the difference is between pumping with pumping and without pumping. And so we have a change in the rising groundwater here. And so we looked at the historical period, versus the future? And so is there a lot of difference? Is the climate expected to have a big change in what goes on? And if you look at the means and medians, they're very similar to each other. There's not a whole lot of difference between them. The maximums are a little bit more here, and that's tied up in these couple of years right here. So there's not a lot of difference. The key thing here is a lot of the frequency of the data is all clustered in this, what is that, maybe 3 to 10 CFS change in rising groundwater. If we sharpen it and look just a little bit more refined in it, and we look at analogous or correlative climate periods, if we take the 1990 to 2019 and look at the 2067 to 96 period, and so we're basically looking at what's the effect of climate change. We're seeing that the reduction, again, we're talking about change over here. Okay, there's a little bit of a change, a little bit greater change, not a lot. What's that, 1.3 or something like that, CFS in the average change expected to occur in the future. So it's not a 50% or 100% or an 80% kind of number. It's a very small percentage that we're expecting to see change when we compare future analogous to historical periods. So we've determined that it's likely at the Cienega area, at the fish hatchery area, that it's going to experience for some period of time water levels that are below ground surface. The rising groundwater goes to 0. So that takes us to the situation where if it's 0, well, how low is the water level going to go? And so that's where this graph comes in. So the groundwater model allows us to extract a hydrograph, and that's just a plot of water level over time for the area near that surface water monitoring site. And so these, I don't know if those are brown or orange dots on there, whatever they look like on your screen, they're kind of orange on mine. They show the simulated future water levels from the groundwater model with climate change imposed on that as well. And so to help us analyze that, we've added the land surface. That's the solid green line. The brown dashed line, which is not dashed on my screen for whatever reason. The brown line here is the 2011 low water level, okay? And we heard recently from Mr. Kibler, the researcher from UC Santa Barbara, and he offered some thoughts that water levels that were about 10 feet below the 2011 water level, that's sort of a critical water level for GDEs. And so we've added the blue line on there to show a 10-foot decline in the water level below the 2011 level. Okay, so what are our observations here? Obviously, the simulated water levels fall below the critical water level, the blue line, during the drought periods. That's pretty obvious and expected. Okay. The majority of the time, the water levels are below the critical water level is during that time period of the analogous 1940s drought. It's this period of time right in here. Okay, that's where the majority of it occurs. Okay. In non-drought, for future water levels in the non-drought, we generally fall above the critical water levels. They're a little bit lower, it appears to be, in the future at this particular thing, but still above the critical water level. You can see that there's far fewer dots in the historical period back here below, between the brown and blue lines, for example. They're mostly between land surface and there. And these dots up in the air right here don't mean that we have water level that's 80 feet above ground surface. It just means that the water level is at ground surface there. So we've got a few observations here that tell us that in the future, it's likely at the Cienega area, at the fish hatchery area, we're going to see, even during our typical, not our Mondo 7-year drought periods, but on our more typical drought periods, that we are going to have instances where it falls below the critical level. The length of time it's below that critical level is, I don't know, maybe that's 5 years right there, maybe a hair more. That's 3 years or so there. Again, 3-4 years there. This is our most recent drought we were in, so maybe that's another 5, 6, 7 years right there, it's below. So we can see that it's the drought periods where we see the water levels that fall below the critical level. Now, this is with pumping. If we subtract pumping, then we get the gray dots here. So I superimpose those on there. It's a busy graph, apologize for that, but I wanted you to see the relationship between the two. So without pumping, we see a lot of instance time the amount of water level decline during the droughts is less, to be expected. And it's, sometimes 10, sometimes 20 feet, less here depending on which particular drought pattern or drought period you want to point at. But a majority of the time it's above the critical water level, the blue level right there, the blue line, and in general higher than what we would see when we have our normal pumping scenarios increase. So the number of months when we turn off the pumping for which the water levels are below the critical level is far fewer than with the pumping scenario. Okay, so outside of the drought periods, the historical and the future periods look pretty similar. So kind of packaging this up a little bit on the surface water aspect of it, hey, we focused on the Santa Clara River and particularly at the Fillmore-Piru and the Santa Paula-Fillmore basin boundaries, with the areas with the rising groundwater as being the most critical to look at. There are no or limited beneficial users or uses of the surface water in those areas. There's no surface water diversions and those kinds of things. It's not an area of extensive recreation or any of those kinds of things. There are GDEs, as we heard earlier, associated with that. During the droughts, there are multiple month sequences with no rising groundwater, both with and without pumping. It's obviously more with pumping than without. Okay. And there are multiple month sequences where the water level declines are greater than that critical water level of about 10 feet below the 2011 marker level. So the question becomes then, we see some impacts from pumping. We look at the historical period, we look at the future projections, and we recognize that drought has a big impact on what goes on with the amount of rising groundwater and the amount, or excuse me, the depth to the shallow groundwater in these areas. And so historical and future conditions don't look to be that much different hydrologically speaking. So the question is, does the agency have a responsibility to mitigate drought impacts if those impacts are not any more severe than the pre-January 2015 impacts? And so SGMA gives the agency the ability to say that we're not going to go back and try to reestablish prehistoric conditions. For example, they've said you can use January 2015 as your benchmark, and you don't have to go back and try to create conditions pre that time period. Now, January 2015 admitted was right in the middle of a drought, a severe drought for this part of the world. And so conditions were not very good overall for groundwater in the county. So the question becomes here, if the agency is in a position where they're not looking to propose projects, they're not proposing projects to move water around. There's no pipelines. We're not saying we're going to pump more over here and less over there. We're not doing any of that kind of thing. We're not seeing chronic declines in water levels. Groundwater storage is fine. It recovers during wet periods. Seawater intrusion is a not applicable. Water quality really isn't an issue that we're focused on. Land subsidence doesn't look to be an issue to get too excited about either. So the rates of surface water depletion in the future are not materially greater than at the January 2015 point. Okay, and we have multiple months with zero rising groundwater, both with and without pumping. So what is the agency's responsibility for that? They cannot mitigate the drought. There's nothing they can do about that. They can't control surface water runoff during streams. They don't have the ability to control surface water in the basin. They don't control how much it rains either. So these periods of drought and then episodic flooding have occurred throughout millennium. I would assume that those are pretty much ubiquitous conditions throughout time. And those are part of the life sequence of the GDEs at these particular areas. So the question for the board to wrestle with is, are you responsible for mitigating those drought impacts, okay, if they aren't any more severe, and if those drought impacts are things that you can't control? So that's a philosophical question to some degree, and one that the board gets to wrestle with. So we're back to the matrix again. And so this is now hopefully a little clearer as you are more informed as to some of the logic that's been developed over the past several meetings on how we came to the various wording that you see in here for MTs, etc. So let's go to the MTs, for example, for groundwater elevation. And so there's been extensive deliberation on how this should look. And last month we settled on something that we would offer for the stakeholders' comment tonight, is that the water level declines below the base of the well screen on more than 25% of the representative wells in the basin. Okay, so what are the representative wells? Let's jump ahead one slide here so I can show you where those are. These are the representative monitoring sites as contained in the draft monitoring and data gaps analysis, a tech memo that's on the agency's website. So again, it's not necessary to monitor every single well in the basin, but to monitor those that are representative. Okay, and so an effort was made to, number one, spatially distribute those wells around the basins, get them spatially separated so we're covering geographic territories. Some effort to find wells with long-term water level records with them, and also wells that were completed in different aquifer zones. So the shallow A zone or a B zone, or it's a combination well, so it's an AB. You'll see the dual color circles there, and a B and a C. So we tried to get some deep wells, we tried to get some shallow wells, but most of the wells are kind of in the B category in the basin. So we leaned a little heavy on that end of it as well. So we're talking about monitoring, and these are your wells, these are your sentinel wells, the ones you're going to monitor and keep track of. There's going to be many more that get actual water level measurements recorded, but these are the ones that we're talking about here in the matrix when we say more than 25% of the wells have their water levels fall below the base of the well screen. The point for the 25% is that this is a basin-wide sustainability plan. We want to know that this is a basin-wide condition. If a water level falls down below the bottom of the well screen in one individual well, one individual representative well, then okay. But is that really representative of the broader conditions across the entire basin? So if we put a little bit higher numeric threshold on that and we say 25% of the wells fall below it, then the board is suggesting here, based on conversations last month, that would be a situation where we would say that's a significant and unreasonable condition and we need to do something about fixing that. So the column right next to it, the MO, is again your opposite. What do you want the basin to look like? What's your desired future condition? Well, we know that these basins operate not unlike, well, much differently from many of the basins that DWR is used to seeing. So DWR gives you comments in their documents about, oh, when the water levels are low, and then you guys are going to do your plan and you're going to come up and you're going to rise up and then you're going to stay at this sustainable level. That's not the way these basins operate. They fill up when conditions are wet, they go down when conditions are dry, they come back up when conditions are wet, they go down when conditions are dry, and they're in this cyclic process. And so we picked the 2011 water level high. That pretty much is is ubiquitous across the basins as the basin is full kind of condition. And so this gives us our goal is we would like for the basin to be full all the time. Okay? We don't have the controlling ability to dictate precipitation and that kind of thing, but that's our goal. We would like for the basin to stay as full as possible. One of the things you kind of want to do is maximize the room you have between your MO, your desired condition, and your MT. Okay, you don't want to put those too close together because you end up bouncing back and forth on them. So give yourself room, give yourself operating room between the two. So that's there. Similar to that, we've got for storage, it's just the estimated historical low for our MT. MO is set at 2011 high levels. Surface water depletion, and this is a unique approach. Again, the agency isn't proposing management actions at this point in time. And so assuming this statement still holds, okay, they're not proposing anything that's going to change the operational regime of the basin. Therefore, the GSP, which is supposed to assess the effects of the implementation of your plan, does not cause significant or unreasonable effects. Okay? So no beneficial users or uses are materially impacted by implementation of the GSP. And that's where that resides at this point in time. Land subsidence, a lot of discussion over that at the last few meetings. And so we settled last month at the board meeting on the MT being total inelastic subsidence. Inelastic meaning that which we can't recover. Remember, we had that little green area in the Piru Basin where water levels increased and the ground surface responded to that by recovering some of the lost by rising, I guess I should say there. And so the idea was to put in inelastic subsidence if you can't recover of 1 foot per year or 1 foot over 5 years. Okay, and then an MO being key to your NSAR data, which would be your monitoring system that you're going to have on an annual basis out there. And so we want to keep those subsidence rates within that little error bar area. We want to keep it low. So that's our desired future condition is to keep that that value low. Water quality, again, not much of an issue for us here from the respect that we're not the regulatory agency. The GSA is not able to regulate water quality. You're not a water purveyor. You're not delivering water, supplying water. And so you'll be in a cooperative agency type role with the county or the EPA or the state Water Resources Control Board or the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And then finally, seawater intrusion is the big NA, not applicable. So we've already looked at the representative wells. And so I wanted to show you the map like we had last month. And so we've used various values and we wanted to show you those groundwater elevations associated with those values at the representative wells. So the top one here, for example, is the projected low water level in the future climate scenario, which we call the 2020 change factor scenario. So there you can see it's 346. The estimated historical low at this well is 338. The bottom of the screen is an elevation 252. So we've got all those plotted here, so it makes it easy to look at what's the difference between this value and that kind of thing. And so this is sort of the point where we ended up last month. And so we're probably way over time. So I'm going to be quiet right now, and let's see if we can go for questions or comments.
Thank you, Tony. And perhaps we'll take a few questions, but if I can offer a suggestion, if somebody has a question pertaining to a specific criteria, we can also address those, when we go through each of the criteria one by one. But Director Minigan, looks like you have a question.
Thank you for that, Tony. So looking back at your SMC table for surface water, groundwater interactions, from what you just shared, it's showing that with the current drought conditions that we are going to be impacting GDE's SP Cienega. And so the statement that the GSP doesn't propose projects or management actions that would change the operational regime isn't really going to help us meet our sustainability goal, because it is going to be impacting GDEs. And that said, like, I understand the rationale of the statement, but without minimum thresholds and management objectives, you can't really quantify that you aren't having an operational regime impact, management action impact on that operational regime. So I would definitely recommend and suggest that we tease out minimum thresholds and management objectives, similar to your table where you had the critical, blue line, quantify that in the minimum threshold or objectives, to give this a little bit more structure.
I think that the nuance in the conversation that we're having right now, and listening to your words very carefully, was you said the drought causes the impacts. And that's the nuance here, is that the drought is causing the impact.
No,
it's
but
not that the basin is operating that way. So that's the nuance between the way this is worded and the conversation we're having now, which is fine. I'm just clarifying.
It's just for your graph, when you put the pumping on and without the pumping, you clearly show that without the pumping, you go within the realms that you want to be in, where you're not having an impact. So I think it's quantifying what that level is for your minimum threshold, that foot level. And like I said before in our previous SMC for surface water depletion discussions, those thresholds might be different for different GDEs. It's probably going to be more protective at SPC and ECHA, because there is clearly an impact there where it might be different, which was also being indicated from what you shared earlier at the Eastern Grove further downstream. Closer to the Santa Paula area. So, it's just teasing that out for the specific GDEs. But that said, when you were talking earlier about the appending on the climate data, I was just wondering to what extent we were incorporating the NOAA climate modeling information that was done through the Integrated Regional Water Management Program for their plan update. Because from my understanding is we were following more DWR's guidance, but the NOAA data that the county did is obviously more specific to the county with regards to climate change projections around precipitation. And I'm just wondering how we incorporated those. And then there was also a recent Science Journal article that shows that we are actually within a mega drought. And I'm just wondering, with regards to that appending on climate and precipitation projections, how we are incorporating the trends that the most current science is showing that those drought periods might be longer. So we do have in your appending on the 7-year drought, but like based on the mega drought information, we might have more of those. And how do we incorporate that into the appending on in those trends?
Yeah, good, all good questions. So early on, we had lots of discussions, we being the consultant team and United, on what future climate scenarios or methodologies should be used for the GSP process. And we looked at what the county had developed through the folks at DRI and that set of documents. And I like those reports a lot, and I was leaning towards using those. But they don't give you the specific information that DWR is requesting that you use for their forward future forecasting. So I talked to DWR about their expectations, and they were in usual state agency lingo. They said, you can use anything you want, but you better justify why you're not using our stuff. Just paraphrased. So the inkling was clearly they wanted us to use their climate change information going forward. And so that was the decision. Rather than try to push against them, we thought that their information was pretty aggressive in that they gave you a wide range of climate change scenarios that they evaluated. And then we picked something to 2070. There's a range of 2070 ones. We picked one that was moderately severe and then applied the climate change factors to that. We also did one that was less severe, a 2030, which I didn't show you because if we're not showing major effects in 2070 with a more severe, why spend time discussing the less severe situation? So that was part one of it, is that we got the actual climate change variables that we needed from DWR, and they weren't available from the DRI, for example, study. Then secondly, it's more local in that we had to look at what precipitation period we wanted to pick up and clone and append to the end of our historical record. And we spent quite a bit of time staring at cumulative departure curves and records of precipitation, and then ultimately made the decision that we wanted to go back as far as the 1940s to be able to catch that 7-year drought and make sure it was represented someplace within the record. And so it's important to keep in mind that 7-year record is rare in the current historical record. There's one instance of it in 90 some years of it. So it doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's certainly not very common. The mega drought situation, yeah, we might be in that, but that's kind of at a much grander scale than what we can do here, unless we get actual specific information on how to adjust our future climate scenario to account for that. I mean, we could go back and manually go into the record and add more drought years to it and see what happens if we had a 10-year drought. Again, all we're doing in the modeling effort is not predicting when it's going to occur, just saying if it did occur, how might the basins respond? That's all it's saying. It's not telling you what time frame it's going to occur in. It's just saying if it occurs, the basins might respond this way or that way. So we don't really have a lot of guidance on how to do that.
I do want to give everybody else an opportunity too, but considering that Australia did have like a 12-year drought, I'd definitely be interested in seeing a longer drought period as a scenario. Yeah, and then based on your earlier philosophical discussion about whether we as an agency should mitigate against drought, you know, I think we need to hark back to our guiding principles, and it's really about sustainability at the end of the day. And I think what comes with that is building in resiliency. And if we do need to fund projects to build in that resiliency, I think it definitely warrants the discussion about what some of those projects would look like in a 7 or 10-year drought scenario, like what we'd need to do, especially when it's related to particular GDEs or particular areas. You know, it's not necessarily a project for all the basins. It might be very location specific, and it could also be a very economical solution to address whatever concerns or impacts come along with minimum thresholds. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in a 7 to 10-year longer drought scenario so that we can adequately plan for the resiliency that we need.
Thank you. Director McFadden has a comment, and then if I could, I'd just like to invite our stakeholders present to raise your hand or put a comment in the chat. Specifically, we're going to take these one by one, and it was good that we started on surface water depletion. So if you have any comments or questions on those, on that particular criteria, please feel free to raise your hand or place your comment while Director McFadden offers his question or comment.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. Tony, I might have to ask Candace for a nature conservancy opinion, but do we know what the plans are for the fish hatchery as far as operations and flow of water that will come from that in the future? Will that resume? Or I've been there when it's in operation, and I've seen more fish eating birds there than any other place in my life except for the coast, because they just sit there and wait for the the occasional fish to get out, and it's quite a flow that comes out of them. Candace, what's the Nature Conservancy planning for there? Will flows resume, and will the Cienega project be dependent on those flows, or what do you guys think? That's a combination Tony and Candace question.
For Tony Emmerich,
I will quickly punt and say I don't know.
Then it's a Candace question.
I mean, I've heard rumors about them not being operational in the future, but that is definitely a rumor, and I don't really want that spread. But in case plans have changed again, I do know that from a restoration practitioner point of view, there are multiple agencies engaged in restoration in and around that site. We're looking at access grants with the Coastal Conservancy. There's restoration grants through the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So it's, there's going to be restoration in and around that area. And the goal is to have an access point for recreation as well.
I guess the real question is, are we counting on the flow from the hatchery to support that?
Well, I think whether or not it's for the hatchery or for the GDE and the restoration efforts, that water is going to be repurposed for that area, yes.
Right, but it's not going to be an increased flow. I would say it's at its stable rate right now, right? The ponds are there. They're going to be putting the trails all through there as their goal. They've got that nature walk little area, and they're doing some, really just trying to develop it in that way, but not on a water, more water demand or more water flow going through. At least that's what I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And perhaps that would be good for them to do a presentation to us so that we can understand that as well.
Yeah, we had said that maybe that can be a future agenda item for the planning for that to come forward as a presentation to our board.
Okay, but it sounds like right now we don't know if the fish hatchery is going to be what sort of a source it will be for augmenting the GDE there.
Yeah, I mean, I've even had discussions because Adam Lambert at UC Santa Barbara has also been engaged in a lot of the planning. And because of the rising water, I have also had discussions about the potential for off-channel habitat for steelhead for oversummering. But whether or not that's going to be incorporated in the planning effort is very preliminary and conceptual at this point.
Okay, and then Tony, one more question for you. I understand the Sigma baseline date, our year is January 1st, 2015. So I guess our goal is not to let conditions get any worse than that. Is that a fair interpretation of the Sigma?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
you're free to do other things, but that's what Sigma says.
Okay, so.
And that was one of the comments from the Nature Conservancy, was a strong recommendation to use the 2011 year rather than 2015.
So Sorry,
We've
go
all
ahead.
been there. Don't worry about it. Just
Exactly.
saying. Many of us have been there. We totally understand it.
Second
that, absolutely.
Good stuff. But
It is.
as far as the law is concerned, January 1st, 2015 are the conditions by law, we need to be focused on.
Yes, you don't have to go back further in time and try to recreate conditions that were in place in 1900, for example. That's what they were trying to do, is to put a bound on that, to say, okay, we're going to just use 2015 as our benchmark. And don't
Okay.
let things get worse than that.
So we need to keep that in mind. That's all for me, for Tony.
Thanks. Do any of our stakeholders have any other comments on the surface water depletion criteria, sustainable management criteria? I'm not seeing any hands raised. Anything in the chat? Just want to offer that up.
There was a comment from Brian Bondi, or no?
I think there was some discussion in the chat about land subsidence and monitoring. I was going to bring that up when we get to that topic, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, and then Dan offered a comment about the previous discussion about the climate change study. He said the VC climate change study did not include data sets we could apply to our modeling. DRI findings were much more narrative in nature. Thank you, Dan. So let's move to the next criteria we were going to discuss, which is the groundwater levels criteria. And I think we heard previously that the Pumpers Association did support these draft criteria. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. And I see, Brian, you have a comment, so I'm not sure if that's something. Oh, did your hand go down, Brian? I don't know if that was on the.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to comment on the surface water.
Okay, didn't see it earlier. So let's go back to that. Thank you. Go for it.
Thanks. Just a brief comment. And I've made this one before. The conversation about GDEs tends to occur in the context of surface water depletion. And I just want to remind everybody that, for the plants, that's actually more related to groundwater elevations. And when we're talking about surface water depletion, we're talking about the actual water flowing at the surface. And there are different considerations for those two different things. We're talking about aquatic species living in and relying directly on the surface water flow under the depletion. And then the GDEs, when we typically talk about GDEs, we're typically referring to the vegetation, which is more of a groundwater level issue and is not really part of the surface water depletion indicator. So I just want to make sure that we parse this out and are considering the right things under the right SMCs as we develop these criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any comments on groundwater elevation as it relates to groundwater supply or GDs? I'm not seeing anything. Okay, let's move to the next. The next one we wanted to talk about was the groundwater storage criteria. Any stakeholder input or other comments on that one? I'm not seeing.
Lisa, if there are no stakeholder, I will reiterate. The pumpers discussion was that it's clear from the stress test model runs that these basins both refill relatively rapidly, easily, very effectively. And so it would be our recommendation that the groundwater storage reduction MT matches the MT for groundwater elevation, because the fact that the groundwater goes lower, the basins refill, so we were not in danger of running out of groundwater storage. The real problem with groundwater levels in terms of access is the well screen depths of the wells, and that's reflected in the MT for groundwater elevation. So it's our recommendation that the MT for groundwater storage mirrors the one for groundwater elevation.
Thank you.
And Lisa, I think I would add to that just that we were assuming that the models show that that does refill, which I believe we believe that that's what it does. So if we can just, as long as they can refill, then those tied together seem to make the most sense for us as the pumpers.
Got it. Thank you. Any other thoughts on groundwater storage or groundwater elevation? Okay, let's move to the next one, which is land subsidence. And we did have a comment or two in the chat box. And then we also had a comment letter from the Pumpers Association. So I wasn't sure if somebody representing the Pumpers Association wanted to kind of summarize that comment letter. Or if that's already been done through the comments you've already made.
I would ask, Brian Bondi's the best one to outline what is in that letter.
Brian, would you like to express those comments here?
Sure. Essentially, when we looked at the land subsidence, we recognized that it's challenging because there haven't been any studies we could find that studied the measured land subsidence as the onset of effects of land subsidence started occurring. I hope that makes sense. The beginning, people usually don't realize they have effects until they're very obvious. So the early onset has not really been studied. We talked to the USGS expert, Michelle Sneed, about this, and she wasn't aware of any studies. So what we looked at were case studies from areas where there had been substantial subsidence and in many cases effects that would probably be considered significant and unreasonable in the Sigma context, and just looked at the rates of subsidence from those case studies, both the rates and the cumulative amounts of subsidence, and felt that we could propose a minimum threshold at the low range of the subsidence values from those studies as an initial basis for establishing where significant and reasonable effects might occur. In other words, the idea is that the lowest amount of subsidence that resulted in significant and unreasonable effects in other areas might be a conservative way to characterize where we might have significant and reasonable effects, because we really don't know. And to really know that better, you'd have to do engineering studies of the specific infrastructure and make assumptions about where that subsidence would occur and how it would manifest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is way beyond the scope of what we're doing for this plan, and maybe unnecessary given the low risk for subsidence anyways. So we proposed, I forget the numbers, I don't have the document in front of me, somebody else might, but we proposed values based on that, and then recommended that the satellite data be used going forward to monitor land surface changes, but to augment that with some continuous GPS data, because the land change data you get from the satellites is just that, it's just land change. You don't know what caused that land change. So what we found in other basins, Mound Basin is one just down the road, the GPS data can help you interpret that data from the satellites and help you differentiate between tectonic movement, earth movement that's occurring because of geological factors, and separate that out from land changes that might be related to groundwater conditions, which is really what we're interested in. So the idea there is to make sure essentially that we don't have a conclusion from the satellite data that drives us in a management direction that isn't really related to groundwater conditions. And so that's something that could be looked at to augment. In a nutshell, that's the proposal. One other recommendation in there is to, during the first 5-year period before the first update, to evaluate the infrastructure, perhaps any studies that would need to be done would be done in that period, and then to develop a contingency plan that lays out actions we would take if and when the basin approaches historical low groundwater levels, and we feel that we're in the potential situation where we might start having subsidence. We would want to have a game plan for how we would address any unexpected subsidence. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I want to get back to the question we had in the chat box. We had a question that says, if land subsidence is not an issue, is it necessary to use the continuous GSP monitoring system? And Brian, I think that you actually offered a response to that in the chat, saying the benefit of the GPS monitoring is to make sure that we can properly interpret the satellite data showing land movement and prevent an incorrect conclusion that land movement caused by tectonics or oil pumping is due to groundwater pumping, which I think you kind of just described as well. Any other comments on the land subsidence criteria that are proposed either, or perhaps the alternate proposal submitted by the pumpers?
Lisa, I guess I've got a question for the pumpers. Is it the pumpers' recommendation that we change the MTs and MOs to what Brian has suggested?
Based, Ed, this is Glenn. So based on our conversation in our last meeting and why we sent that letter is we thought, I guess the short answer is yes. Those were what we thought were reasonable numbers that we would recommend that Tony and his team take into consideration for the MT and the MO. I will say there was kind of a side conversation, and you can see it in some of the chats tonight, is there was a question, and it was shown, I think, earlier on Tony's slide, where it showed the summary of inelastic subsidence potential, and it shows Fillmore as being low and Piru being very low. There was a discussion whether the GPS monitoring, would we need one in each basin? Would we start with just one, perhaps in the Fillmore Basin, with it being maybe potentially a little more susceptible, and maybe not right away in Piru? So there's still that was still a question potentially to put in that GPS, but overall, yes, the letter we sent, I think, is what our recommendations would be to take into consideration for adjusting the MTs and the MOs.
Well, I think the recommendations make sense to me. So we're not voting on it, but that would be my opinion.
And we do have board deliberation, planned on this once we close out the stakeholder workshop, just as a note. Brian, was there something you wanted to say?
Well, I was just going to say that, Tony has proposed 1 foot per year, and I think I would recommend that we hear from Tony. It doesn't have to be tonight, but maybe he's looked at some other studies and has a rationale for 1. I think our number was like 0.6. They're not too much different, but I'd like, I think we should consider the basis that Tony has for the 1 foot per year.
I can give you 2 points on that. It's very familiar. It's very similar to what is being proposed in a lot of other basins that have a whole lot more subsidence issues than we have in these 2 basins. And it also is heavily tainted by board conversations that we had, maybe it was 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago, on subsidence, where the perspective was that the vast majority of the land within the 2 basins is agricultural or undeveloped. Let's just put it in the undeveloped category. And so proposing something that's very small really isn't going to cause a impact to agricultural land. So the feeling was bump it up a little bit and go for more than 1 foot as a kind of a metric to use for that, but also to say that we're going to use the INSAR data to monitor every year. And DWR has indicated that they're going to try to start releasing that more frequently. So maybe as much as twice a year. So you'd have the ability to get a peek at that INSAR data more frequently rather than less frequently. So your kind of early warning system in the INSAR is potentially going to be on a more refined scale than in the past. So
Thank you.
I would also like to say that I think we do need to consider, perhaps in the next 5 years, having a study done to identify what is the critical infrastructure. Because clearly trees aren't, the river isn't, but maybe the bridges over the river are, and most certainly the wastewater systems in the cities are definitely are, and I think we need to know where they are and what kind of sensitivity they are, because there are large areas of the basin that subsidence really will have no effect. But there are probably certain specific areas that we could identify that are more critical, and we need to know how much those are. And I mean, if this basin tectonically over history is moving down, particularly on the south side, I think the GPS stations are a good, safe way to be able to long-term separate those two effects, because we could get into a creeping effect, or we could have an earthquake that moves things, and if we don't have a way to separate them, we could find our minimum threshold being a problem.
Thank you. We have some comments in the chat box, taking us back just for a minute. Since I'm not seeing any more comments about land subsidence, so I'll just jump back a minute with this question on the GDEs. Is it likely that the overall footprint of GDEs are currently larger due to more water in the basins because of new water introduced into Ventura County from LA County Sanitation District annually over the last 50 years?
I can I think I can address this, and Bruce, if you're still on, if you can chime in to help me. If you look at the extent that's if I can share my screen, I can answer that question, I think.
Tony, okay.
All right, thanks, Tony. So if you look at the extent of where the area of rising groundwater was mapped here, it hasn't necessarily extended. There's been some other land uses that have sort of broken this up a little bit. The way we've drawn the Del Val riparian goes down a little further downstream, a little further, and there was also a comment by Dan in the chat about that. And the reason we did that is that we were using the vegetation maps and just basically going downstream to where following the willows and cottonwoods. And some of those, there may be some contribution that's from upstream releases. That's really a question that's going to require a model to parse out the relative importance of it. But it could be sustaining dry season surface flows a little bit, for sure. That's a hem and a haw sort of answer, but it really does require a model to get down to the nitty gritty of parsing where the source of the water is from.
Thank you.
Related question. Mr. Broderick, on the map that you just showed, I was wondering what there seems to be an increase in what you're calling forested area in the Sespe Creek, Sespe Santa Clara confluence. I just wondered what do you think was happening there?
I think Bruce may know, he was one of the authors of that. He may know more about this, but I think part of it is that there was maybe not as much historical data there. But Bruce, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so yeah, I think there's the caution with the historical ecology study in that you're dealing with, coarser data sets from 200 years ago in terms of surveyor notes and other things. So it took a more substantial and persistent patch of riparian vegetation to get everyone's attention. So it's certainly possible that smaller patches were missed on that, or scrubbier patches versus tree-dominated riparian stands, may have been just overlooked and not commented on in the historical records. So you don't want to, you can only go so far, but there were, many multiple data sources over, decades or centuries that were, consistent in terms of showing the persistence of those areas, as well as the historical dry gap reach, downstream of Piru there. So
it'd also be interesting to know what the effects of the changing Pole Creek 90 degrees had on the whole system there. But
so that would be, yeah, so it's not something we looked into detail that particular area, but we do have the historical air photos that go back to, I think, 1927 in that area. So
sounds very interesting, but also way beyond the scope of our baseline year too.
Yes. But I'd be happy to follow up on that, outside of our official scope. It's definitely an interest of mine, is picking spots like that and delving into historical ecology deeper.
Bruce, just for clarification, when you're saying forested area, I think of the deep forests in the mountains with tons of trees, and we're talking about our river. So what to you is quantifying a forested area?
Yeah, so this is, once again, the historical ecology, it was, it's going to vary from observers, but it was, a notable stand, persistent stand of mature, cottonwoods and willows that stayed on the landscape, sort of decade after decade. You might get some shifts after floods.
So are we talking 20 trees, 10 trees,
so
an acre of trees?
So that's the, there's no, for current mapping, we'd be looking, you would typically have a minimum mapping unit of, for like a river scale mapping like we've done, be a 1 acre minimum map unit. If anything smaller, you wouldn't pick up unless it was like a really sensitive habitat. But for the historical records, you're probably talking, it's probably got to be like more like 10 acres to really pick it up, consistently through a span of years with different observers. And then, I mean, there are some records like the original land survey records where the surveyors may have noted a particular tree, for like noting the location of trees for section corners and things like that. So that's the only case where we'd get observations on individual trees. So
okay, so is it really considered a forested area? I just, because is there multiple trees versus a forest of just tons of acre? I'm just trying to get an understanding as to setting in my mind what we're talking about. And maybe you live in this, in your world, I don't live in that as much, like definition.
Yeah. So it's
trying to
general,
understand for the layman, what is it?
Right. And in some cases I might have described, I might describe it personally more as a riparian woodland, which might be, you'd still have, dozens of trees to have a patch that was worth recognizing, but there might be gaps in the canopy of, cottonwoods. But, most riparian forests, when they talk about a forest condition, it's like that is East Grove area, certain spots where the canopy from adjacent mature trees is generally touching. You don't have that many gaps where you can, like an aerial photo where you would see all the way to the ground.
Okay, that's good, because I think that there's more stands, which if you would say, versus a forest. And so I want to make sure we're using our vocabulary in the right way for DWR and anyone who wouldn't know our area all the, I just want to make sure. And the other question I had for you is, the GDE report that we're talking about, is it at the same time frame as the water droughts that we're talking about? I hear you say we're going way back, and I don't know if that's 150 years. Is it what it is? I need clarification.
The way back was in reference to this separate historical ecology study, the Beller et al. Paper that Christian referenced for that one map. But for the GDE analysis, our focus is most of it's in the last 10-year period, like going back, to before the latest drought. But as you can see from some of Christian's graphs, we were able to go back to 1985 with the Landsat satellite imagery to look at changes in the NDVI index. But all that's trying to provide context for the current condition, what we're seeing in more recent years.
Okay, so that's why I was wondering what are the wants versus the needs and all that DWR is asking for us to do. So I wanted to get an understanding of what the terminology and what the vision of it for the future, just like we're planning for droughts is. So, okay.
Those are great questions. And just back to the riparian vegetation, the forest, we're trying to use, standard terminology within the vegetation community in terms of citing other sources. But that, like you said, that's definitely not necessarily obvious to the broader public. So
no, and if there's any way in your report that you can explain that, it would be great, because we have to talk to all stakeholders, and I want to make sure that people understand it, like me.
Okay, Christian and I will definitely make note of that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I would chime in and say, normally people think of forests with trees, and do cottonwoods and willows qualify biologically as trees?
Yes, so cottonwoods definitely, and the willows we're talking about are tree forms. There are shrubbier willow species as well, like the sandbar or coyote willow, which does occur on the river, is a shrub, not a tree.
Right, and the willows I've seen as stands, but I haven't seen full forests of them. So I just want to make sure we're painting the right picture.
Yeah, and that historic East Grove is the best remaining example, on the river of what we think the historical condition was that would be more representative of that lusher, denser, true riparian forest with lots of mature trees or trees of mixed ages and dense canopy. And what we see elsewhere on the river is just smaller patches of that.
Okay.
And Bruce, presumably when you get a flood like we did in '69 that basically resets everything, clearly these plants come back, and it's not growing from roots that were left, or they reseed in the same areas for the same reasons that they were there before. Is that?
Yeah, that's generally true. So what we have is a very dynamic system. Unlike a lot of the other river systems we work in, we don't have the larger storage reservoirs and highly altered and managed hydrology within the river system. So the big floods come in, they wipe out a lot of the existing mature vegetation, but there are enough surviving trees that they provide a seed source in the subsequent years to then recolonize those new bare sandy surfaces. And the reason you see the historical persistence of these forested wetland riparian complexes is that this area of rising groundwater creates those conditions of wetter soils that are suitable for seed germination. So part of the benefit we have in this system compared to others is all the prior work that's been done that gives us a much better understanding of just how dynamic this river system is. And the challenge then, I think for present purposes, is teasing apart, when you see a change in NDVI or the extent of a certain amount of cottonwood willow vegetation, how much is that is sort of within the expected range of the natural pattern versus what's being driven by human causes in this particular case, what's more explicitly linked to groundwater pumping.
And presumably that same's true, although we don't like to think about it, but CAL FIRE lists the river as a high fire area. Do these areas typically recover from fire the same way? Because presumably before we came, they burned.
Well, so that's a key. That is a change largely due to the invasion by Arundo donax. So you've got our native cottonwood willow and other riparian systems were generally naturally pretty resilient and resistant to fire. So often they served as fire breaks. You'd have fire coming down the slopes to the river and stopping because it was a moister, wetter environment. But with Arundo coming in, it provides this highly flammable fuel load that then can carry the fire across the river to the other side of the valley, but also, within the riparian corridor itself. And that's a change from historical conditions. And it's a double whammy in that Arundo is much more responsive to fire. So it'll start regrowing immediately. So get a fire in the fall, you can see Arundo regrowth up to, an inch per day of actual regrowth in the fall, whereas the native species, there were some species, if they weren't completely killed, might be able to resprout, but they typically wouldn't start most of that regrowth until the spring. And so Arundo gets its head start and it creates this positive feedback loop. So that's separate from the GDE issue, but that's a key reason why we've got a lot of attention recently on trying to create and find funding for a more watershed-wide Arundo removal program.
So biologically, is it possible? I mean, to presume, okay, first of all, Arundo, it's called an invasive species. Did it arrive naturally?
No, it was introduced often as a windbreak and other sort of landscaping. So it was a human introduction from Eurasia, along with a lot of our other invasive species. So, and we don't have exact records of when it was introduced in the watershed, but there's some evidence that, it may have been present in low numbers around the early 1900s. But then it's in recent decades where it's really taken off in our system and across the Southwest in general. So I'm seeing this in many other river systems now too. So it's a big change.
Could the Arundo be taking the space of the willows so that they're not propagating, which you're trying to say we should get, but they're not going to grow because of the Arundo?
Yes, that's
wondering it's not as water dependent as it is the invasive plants that are stopping their regrowth. I don't know.
They're all factors that I think to do a detailed analysis, we try to tease apart, but it's not an easy thing to do. The other thing is, Arundo has a very high evapotranspiration demand. So, there's interest in just removing Arundo to try to, reduce water loss through that route. And that would increase, potential, at least at some level, for groundwater recharge, but also making more moisture available for regeneration of the native species. So,
but then sometimes you can't remove the Arundo because then there's other species that you have to worry about. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the challenge with doing a more comprehensive program is, you can't just do a one-time Arundo removal and walk away. You have to come back and monitor and treat resprouts. Plus, in many cases, many systems will see, what are called secondary invaders. So other non-native weedy species that come in once you remove the Arundo, and there's the threat of them out competing the natives as well. So it's sometimes you can remove the Arundo in a system that's as dynamic as the Santa Clara. You might get, just nudge the system into more natural regeneration of the natives and maybe have success that way. But, in most cases, it requires a more persistent effort.
You mentioned that Arundo recovers very quickly from fire compared to some of the native tree forms. It also really likes the big flooding events too. those rhizomes, the root structures, as you know, just go every place. And every place they land and get covered by a sandbar or something, you get an instant arundo forest, you know, as soon as everything settles down.
Yeah, so that's a big challenge for a more comprehensive program. One of the considerations is how do you make sure you have permits and funding to go in on a post-flood or post-fire contingency plan. So the flood or fires removed a lot of the arundo biomass, or sometimes maybe not where you want it, moving the arundo downstream to bridges and other things where it can have impacts. But it's done a lot of the work that you'd have to do manually without that flood or fire. But if we don't get in there right away, we're just going to see a repeat of arundo coming back in and the natives being outcompeted.
Well, the 2005 flood event that rearranged the river pretty dramatically planted arundo in a lot of places.
Definitely, and spread tamarisk seedlings as well, although they didn't persist as well, but they're more widespread now than they were when we did the original mapping in 2005. And then arundo also got washed out. I heard stories of racks of arundo debris out in the Channel Islands as well. So
both tamarisks and willow don't even require seeds. Just a piece of stem or root, if it's if deposited in the right place, will root out. I pulled up plenty in ditches.
yeah, and the black cottonwood is better at vegetative reproduction than the Fremont cottonwood that we have further inland. So.
Well, then, Bruce, based on what the technical study, it sounds like our basin is extremely resilient and keeps coming back. And so that's a good sign, I think,
yep.
Especially when we're talking about these measures right now. It gives me really good hope that with this resilience basin, you know, the markers that we have things are gonna survive and keep going. So that's good.
I have to agree that, you know, the challenges with climate change predictions is if we have, you know, longer intervals between like a big drought and then that the floods that might provide good conditions for recruitment of cottonwoods and willows. You know, the amount we have of and the locations might shift more than what we're seeing now, but the system is resilient, much more so than, you know, many other systems I've studied around the West.
Right, and I look at it as our crops too. You know, in Ventura County, we used to have a lot of different crops, and we've been very resilient in what we bring here, or what we're planting, and so forth. So, kind of think of nature in that same way.
Lisa, I'd like to circle back to some questions from earlier. Is this a good time, or do you want to leave it open for comments? And
let's circle back, but there's just two comments, if I can just get those, you know, read out, just so we don't forget. From Rachel Lennon, I would like to continue to encourage the board to always be aggressive as possible when finalizing these SMCs. We have very resilient basins and would be prudent to make sure we don't artificially limit ourselves. And then Katie Brokaw agrees with Rachel. Everything presented here indicates we have very resilient basins and there is no need to set unnecessary limits. And then I just want to note, we didn't call out water quality as one of the criteria to open comments to. So we can do that, and we can also kind of close the workshop portion and move back to the board meeting for deliberation, or have questions in this context. I'll leave that to your preference.
I guess I have one question I'd like to ask Mr. Broderick, if he's still there. There you are. I was asking about the on the spread on your presentation, groundwater dependent species special status of the plant. Just wanted to be sure I understood which plants those were.
Yeah, and I was looking at our data sheet, and when I put that, I produced I made the talk and the document were due the same day, so there was some rush that happened in the slide productions. And so the plants that we listed I overcounted them in the presentation. And so I just counted up all the plants, and it's actually just the likely ones that we would include to be similar to wildlife, and those are indicated in that table in the document.
Okay, and it looks like that's just the white rabbit tobacco.
In the Piru, yeah. And then let me double check the Fillmore. Get there.
And the white rabbit tobacco is known from the fish hatchery restoration site.
Although white rabbit tobacco is herbaceous perennial, isn't it? And not necessarily dependent on groundwater dependent ecosystems, but is more of a general riparian species. Would you say that's true?
It's yeah, we had some debate over that, and you find, I think it will occur in areas that are where it's much more highly unlikely to be tapping groundwater. So it is but it is associated in the Santa Clara River system with the broader GDE units, which is why
I'm familiar with some of the other species that are not likely, and some of those you can see a GDE from where they live, but they're not in GDEs. They might be in a slope overlooking a GDE. They might be an annual that's in a sandy area that is close to a GDE, but they're not necessarily, they're certainly not dependent on groundwater for the roots.
And I think, and that's one of the challenges we have in going through like the mapped occurrence databases and other things is, sometimes the spatial coordinates are not precise. Other times, the location might be, like you said, showing it in or very close to a likely GDE unit, but we may not, for some of these species, we don't have very good habitat data. So it's like, are they typically associated with, wetlands or moist riparian situations, or are they highly variable and, and more adaptive to a variety of situations, in which case, once again, that would put them up towards the end of the spectrum where we'd consider them, more unlikely.
Well, I think we need to be very careful when we're considering these species of importance. Condors have certainly flown over the GDEs, but unless there was a dead cow down there, they probably wouldn't be very interested.
Yeah.
And there are some species that are very directly related, but we just have to be careful not to cast too broad a net here and to really understand what the relationship is with the individual species, not just assume that everything that's on a list is going to go away if we have a drought.
Well, if we did put a considerable amount of time into trying to figure out the groundwater dependence, I mean, I think that's most of the time of putting the list together. The problem we run into is that for plants and other things, that people have traditionally thought of them as being just dependent on wetlands or water, but not what the source of that water is. And so the real challenge we've found in the GDE world is that plants don't really care usually, right? They just want water. And so the real challenge we found is trying to figure out what's groundwater dependent and what's not. And usually it's not a black and white answer. And there's a lot of gray area that we have to dance around. And we strive to do the best we can, but we're also trying not to just automatically shut things out that could be groundwater dependent or too early in this process.
Well, I'd be surprised if a plant with a bulb or an herbaceous perennial or a biennial plant has got not too many have roots that go down 10 or 15 feet. But
well, Ed, that's a good point, because DWR also has their GDE list, and they had the ones set in their program that we have to be concerned with. Is the white rabbit tobacco in that list? Because I know the cottonwoods were, but I didn't think there was anything else.
Well, I think the list that I'm referring to is the special status plants that were listed in the GDE tech memo.
Yeah, so that's that list, and that list is culled from a total list that had more plants that we got rid of the ones that were obviously not groundwater dependent. And that's true for all the species. And the ones that were there where we weren't quite sure, for the most part, if we couldn't eliminate it, I think we kept it in if it could go either way, because sometimes in some situations they might be groundwater dependent and some they might not. And as Bruce was saying, often the spatial information we have is like center of a topo map. Like the coordinates will be the center of a 7.5 minute quadrangle. So you don't know enough about where it is to be able to break it down any further than that.
Yes, but DWR states that you have to be concerned with your limits based on routes 30 feet or more, not on routes
30
that are
feet
2
or
inches.
less. 30 feet or less. And most of the plants that we're talking about have much shallower roots than that. The oaks can get up to 30 feet, but our cottonwoods and willows and the special status plants are often much more shallowly rooted.
Well, I think we, yeah, I'll have to relook at that because I thought there was a 30 foot and deeper, not a 30 foot and up. So I appreciate that.
We actually have a comment from Steve Slack with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he's saying that in some GDEs, they've had groundwater tables deeper than 30 feet. And these would likely be eliminated in our current tech memo in the GDE map with fluctuating water tables occurring throughout the year. How do we make this call?
Thank you.
So our 30-foot determination was, we used, so we got a groundwater contour surface that was generated by United. We took I think we used 2019, which was actually pretty high, which is the high of the series of ones we got. It was the highest one, and we used that and compared it to a ground surface. So we had LiDAR of the ground surface. We compared it to the elevations of the contours, and that's how we did our 30-foot determination. And the report we've put out is a draft, and if people have comments of GDEs that we've missed, we are open to hear about that and to try and incorporate that and understand it in our maps.
So I would then, Steve, request that if possible, could you share the GDEs that you're referencing with us via AVA so that we can get that information to Stillwater Sciences accordingly? Yeah, sure. Okay, we got to thank you. So I'm sure we can arrange that.
Brian has a comment that's 30 feet is a rule of thumb, not a regulatory requirement, and that is 100% true. And we used it just as a first cut, thinking that most of the GDEs we're concerned with were going to be have much shallower roots than that. But if there are ones that we missed that have deeper roots, we'd be very interested.
So, Lisa, just a kind of a comment, some things that maybe some general points that have been kind of running around my mind and maybe some others. It seems like there's still a lot of discussion to be had on these things. We're just getting quite a large memo and information that's still a draft and we're going to have to get into. So some of the things I think it's important for our next meeting to get some responses back and some feedback on it. Just a couple of things that keep running around in my mind is we still have to determine what's significant and unreasonable. And I'm not sure how easy that's going to be. And it's going to be critical for me to understand the more data that we have, and I'm not just saying quantity, but more of the precise data that we have is going to be more helpful for me to make a decision in things like what exactly is important. What is our requirement? I know tonight we talked about going back to our January 2015, I think is our date. On the one side, I'm sure there's a lot of us are passionate about a lot of different aspects of this, and we would love to go back and create a utopia, get us something back to 100 years ago or 150 years ago. I'd like to get it back to when I was a kid when I could fish for trout in the stream, but I don't know that I'm going to get back to that. And so there's some things I think we need to keep focused on. We have to be sustainable in 20 years, I think is what, if I understand that correctly. So it's not something that we have to have a final answer right now that's going to get us there. And so when we're having these discussions to make our decisions, I think we need to know what exactly is the most critical things. And that's what we're hoping from Stillwater, hoping from all of the stakeholders to provide those things. What are the key critical elements? Because if everything's important, then nothing's important. So there has to be down to some significant things there. And then how do we, stay within our tasks and our guidelines? And that's what I'm looking for, some help, just to make sure that we're not drifting too far outside of that, just because we may be passionate about things. And at the same time, I don't even know what all those important things are. So that's where I'm looking for, as a board member to help make those decisions. So just some of those things, I think when we have clear outline stuff, it'll be easier to make final decisions, tough choices and things. As of right now, after 130 pages of that memo, I don't even know that I can, I've gained more tonight, but I think I'm still trying to digest some of that. And so I'm really hoping that in our next meeting, we can have some of that brought to the table and say, here are the key species, the key amounts, the key items, so we can make some decisions. And again, knowing that we may not have to make every final decision now, but what are some of those thoughts that would get us for the next 5 years as we're working towards having this sustainability? So I don't know if that makes sense or it's just rambling, but it feels like that would help me as a board member.
Thank you.
I would echo that. I mean, I'd also like to say thank you. I mean, this Christian, this report is amazing. And it was obviously an enormous amount of work. And I've been through it a couple of times and I still don't think I'm scratching the surface. We have an enormous amount of data and we need to understand it. And then we do need to understand what's important because there's a lot of stuff in here. And, obviously some things like condors, clearly groundwater, even though they're there, that's not important. And I noticed walnut trees. We used to grow walnuts and I thought walnuts were long gone. They're not important, but I really think we need to hear from the environmental community what is important. We need priorities, and so that we can understand what's important from all of this information. It's a great document and a great definition or description of everything that's here. And we can't save everything. We can't make everything perfect. So we're going to have to know what's important.
So I just want to add, I think Stillwater did a great job of mapping the GDs and describing the ecological conditions and the critical species. As mentioned earlier, the tech memo we were expecting earlier we were initially talking about a special board meeting on March 3rd. And when Supervisor Long reached out, I said, well, that's not going to give us enough time to coordinate a joint comment from a multitude of environmental stakeholders. And unfortunately, the tech memo came out only on Thursday, and I am coordinating multiple stakeholders. And in the short turnaround, I've only received comments from the Nature Conservancy. I've only been able to review the document once myself, never mind a reread. So I understand that there is a need to hear from the environmental community, but considering that we only received this important document but a few working days ago, we are going to need more time to coordinate and formulate that response. And I am going to endeavor to have that response prior to our April 1st meeting. But 4 days was not sufficient for us to provide that valuable input.
Thank you. Those are really good points. I apologize. You might have seen me laugh, but my kids just came in. I've been in the same spot since about 8 o'clock this morning, and they were very shocked. So apologize. Christian and Bruce, I think this is wonderful. Please know, if you're new to this board, we ask these questions just to find out information. This is all a great learning experience for us, and we will continue to ask questions. That's what I love about this group, is that we do try to dive into the details and to understand. This is like our first round of talking about this, just like with all the other sustainable management criterias, we keep thinking about it, like what else can we do? And so we'll definitely be asking more questions. So just be prepared. It's a good thing, a good process. It's all the stakeholder engagement. I just want to reiterate, because it's very helpful for us to really get a good understanding, because we do need to know what Director Pace was talking about. I completely agree. This is all great information, but what is it that we're utilizing to make decisions? And appreciate your time and effort on this. I really do.
And Christian and Bruce, as a person who's been interested in native flora and fauna for my whole life and studied a lot of it, and I live within sight of the river, it's pretty interesting. So I appreciated all the work that went into what you did. I think some of the may want to pare down some of the list a little bit, just to make them more reasonable, but it was very, very interesting. I guess I'm a plant and animal nerd and enjoyed it. So appreciate that, and thank you.
Chair Long, I'd also like to reiterate that, and I meant to say this, is I think, I mean, this memo's come out late and it's jammed us, but we need to find every way we can to give the environmental community the chance to review it, to have their comments and to participate in the discussion. And I hope April 1st is enough time. And for Tony, yeah, it's not, I know, I agree. And for Tony Morgan, I think we need to try to do our best to finalize all the SMCs except this one, so that he can get on with his work and we can maybe get a little more time here. So, because I think we need to hear the discussion, and I'm not sure that on April 1st we're going to be ready to commit to that SMC. I don't think it's fair.
And that said, you know, a lot of the resource agencies are reviewing multiple GSAs and GSP development, and so, you know, I can potentially collate comments from nonprofit organizations, but with regards to the resource agencies, like April 1st is not a realistic timeline whatsoever for NIMS and Department of Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Gordon, on the other hand, I bet Tony is looking at our calendar. Tony Morgan is looking at the calendar right now and pulling his hair out every time we bump everything ahead a month. He's probably getting more gray hair, and his blood pressure is going up every time we do that. So we gotta be careful we get this all done in time too.
Well, and I think that supports what the conversation of deadlines as to, okay, stakeholder feedback for GDEs or subsidence needs to end at a certain time. This is a plan, but it's a working plan. So we will be revising it in 5 years. We will be making those tweaks, but I think we have to do that due diligence to set expectations too, so that we can continue.
And I have to say, in general, I agree with many of the comments. We have to keep in mind we live in a resilient, we're working with very resilient and healthy groundwater here compared to just about any other part of the state. We're in a good spot. Let's not restrict ourselves when it's not necessary.
I would echo that we just I think we need to have a plan. We need to have it broad enough that we're setting the framework, knowing that we have to be within 20 years. For me, I want to come to an answer. So I'm worried that we're going to try to come and find answers and have it so restrictive, so tightened up. And I don't know if we need to be quite that way. So if we can get to a point where we set the framework, if we can be tight on some of them, that's great. If we say something like, right now, we don't have enough information to define all the GDEs exactly, because we need some of these shallow monitoring wells, or we need a few more years to monitor and develop. Can we put something in there saying, we don't have enough information now, but we're working together, and this is our plan to gather information over the next 3, 4, 5 years, so that we're going to be revisiting this and coming into more detail with everyone. Because as we said, even if we say another month from now or 2 months from now, that still may not be enough information for all of this. So can we just put a structure together that we can agree on to get us over the next few years, so that maybe a more detailed report and stuff is, or part of the plan is in our 5-year update. And I'm not just trying to kick the can down the road. I think to do it justice, we need to have enough information to do that. And that's without me knowing about the GDEs and stuff. It just, from my trying to solve problems, it seems like we need enough information to solve it correctly and not just guess.
So we need to build flexibility into the GSP.
Sorry, I haven't spoken up too much, but I echo everything that all of the directors are saying and what Director Pace said right now. I know as I was reading the document, and again, it was so well done, Mr. Broderick, thank you so much for this information. Again, as a newbie to this whole area and sort of, representing again, the community of Fillmore, one thing that pointed out to me was, I was looking, for example, when you talk about the Sespe Creek riparian complex, and, at the end, as you go through, ecological value, moderately high, ecological condition, good, and then susceptibility to changing groundwater, low. But then the first bullet point is there's no shallow monitoring wells in this area. And so as someone who's just sort of looking for things, I'm like, well, that might be a need. And like Mr. Pace, Director Pace said, if those needs are there, I think we're a well-informed group with all of this data that we have to say that a need is there, and we're going to, to further look into that. I'm sorry, that's just one little tidbit that I wanted to add to the conversation as sort of an example of being okay with wanting to get more information, as we move forward, like you said, in this, 5-year plan, Director Pace, or, to be able to develop more. So, thank you.
And we've got to have a GSP in DWR's hands by January 2022. So we've got to make it all work somehow.
Well, with that, Lisa, we have water quality to still talk about before.
Yeah, I don't think there's any comments on that. So I think we can close out the workshop portion and go back to the regular board meeting, which I think we've kind of done some of that in this session. But if I could summarize what I think we heard tonight and got out of the workshop, was that it sounded like the groundwater level sustainability criteria, I didn't hear objections or suggestions for changes to that. There was a suggestion to change the groundwater storage to match the groundwater level elevation. We heard a suggestion for an alternate land subsidence criteria, and we had no comments on water quality. And then with regard to surface water depletion, we heard a suggestion to create minimum objectives, minimum thresholds and objectives rather than what was proposed. So with that, I think we should close out the workshop and get back to concluding the board meeting.
Okay, so the workshop is information only, so there's no motion. Or do we need to receive and file it? I think we're.
Madam Chair, I'd recommend receiving and file, just so we have a clean record.
Okay, that was my gut instinct on that one. Can I get a motion to receive and file the information presented today and the workshop stakeholder engagement?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. And seconded by Glenn. So it's been first by Director Minigan, second by Director Pace. And any further questions? Eva, if you could roll call, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. That motion is approved. And then next we are on to the Sustainable Management Criteria Development 5A.
Excuse me, Kelly, one question for Lisa. Lisa, did you get Matt Freeman's last comment?
I saw that once once we were closing that out, but I can read that off to everybody if you'd like.
Chair Long, I think it's
Yes,
valuable.
please read it off.
Sure. I also agree with Rachel's comment regarding our resilient basins, even to the extent that I am almost ready to reverse my support of continual GPS monitoring of subsidence for the Piru Basin, and that maybe it should be declared as not applicable because much of the Piru Basin soil profile, where many of our wells are located, is mostly comprised of sand, gravel, rock, and very little clay. Therefore, we need to be careful to set MTs and MOs for subsidence that may or may not be necessary given a very stable basin that is not very expansive. I understand the potential that any subsidence truly be attributed to plate tectonics and not subsidence due to overpumping.
Thank you. I want to make sure that's included in our stakeholder engagement. Thank you. Okay, 5A, the last item of the meeting, it's 8:40, Sustainable Management Criteria Development. Tony Morgan, I think this is you.
I think the intent of this motion item was for the opportunity for the board to deliberate, much as we've been doing for the last hour or so, on the various SMCs that were offered. So I think we've kind of already covered that deliberation effort, unless there are additional comments from the directors.
Directors, do you have any other input to state to Mr. Morgan in regards to the sustainable management criteria? Will there be any changes that we see at the April 1st meeting?
There'll be changes to the matrix. There'll be changes to the matrix in response to what I heard as guidance from the directors and stakeholders today.
Okay. All right. Any other questions on it? So it'll be just a motion to approve our comments. It's not final, it's just in motion, right?
Yeah, Chair Long, it seems like this was considered for action, but at this point, if the board takes no action, your consultant is going to make some changes and it'll be back before you. So if you move to 5B, there'll have been no action on 5A, and you can move forward if that helps.
Yes, that makes me feel much more comfortable.
I think we're tabling 5A until future meeting.
Wonderful, good. I'm glad we all agree on that. I just did not want to finalize that if that's the case. All right, so then with that, let me flip to the next page, and it looks like we are done with tonight's meeting in regards to our stakeholder workshop. Lisa, I want to say thank you for running a very well-run stakeholder workshop. Really appreciate it. Christian and Bruce, thank you very much for your insight and more details on the GDEs. It's so much better to have a presentation than just a report of 40 pages that you're reading and so forth. So I would greatly appreciate that. And board members and stakeholders, thank you so much. We will be having our special meeting on April 1st, not a Fool's Day, but April 1st at 5 o'clock. And Director Pace, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, just one comment. Just when we get to our meeting for the first, I think it was very informative tonight, and we had, I think, an hour and a half of presentation and stuff. What worries me is when we get through so far into presentation that it burns everybody out, so there won't be as much commentary. So if we could set the stage so that it goes into discussion relatively quickly for the first, if that's at all possible. That just seems like that would, I'm hoping the stakeholders will come prepared and ready to discuss and not have to have new people and have to bring them all up to speed again. So just something, I don't know if that makes sense to everyone else, but I would hope that would be the case.
I had something of a similar comment, and I'll work with Mr. Emmerich, and we'll come up with an outline for the April 1st meeting where we skip all the preliminaries on the sustainable management criteria, go right to the matrix, and then start the discussion.
One suggestion that might be is if each of the board members, I don't know if this makes sense, but if board members, stakeholders, the technical consultant team, if we came up with some questions that might guide the discussion, maybe that would be helpful. We could get those formulated. If people have kind of questions to kind of direct the thought process, that might be helpful getting everyone going in the right direction.
Thank you for that feedback, Director Pace. Appreciate it. Before we leave today, directors, I want to give you one last chance or opportunity to make any closing comments.
Chair Long, I want to be sure too that if at all possible, both Bruce and Christian are in attendance at that April 1 meeting, because I know it's all the SMCs, but I think we're honing in on all of them except this last one, and that's this stakeholder workshop is hopefully going to be the chance for all the stakeholders to really comment after having a chance to review. So I hope you both can be there because your input's very valuable.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, our meeting is adjourned and we'll see you April 1st at 5 o'clock on Zoom. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
I'm trying to sign off. I think I'm numb from Zoom.
Join the club.
Thank you. Bye.